Good evening, my dear friends. कब के पिछड़े. I hope everybody is doing great. I hope your classes of economics are going on well. Few classes which I was supposed to take, one topic which I was supposed to take is still remaining, and I'll try to finish off that topic as quickly as possible. How many classes of economics in total? In total अभी तक कितनी क्लासेस हो चुकी हैं इकोनॉमिक्स की आपकी इन टोटल? कैन एनीबडी टेल? लास्ट व्यक्ति प्रशांत कुमार, तुम बता देना. एनी पर्सन, एनी वन पर्सन, जस्ट टेल मी हाउ मेनी क्लासेस ऑफ इकोनॉमिक्स इन टोटल? Good to see you everybody. Good to see everyone. 51. Okay. चलो ठीक है. I got the answer. चलो start करते हैं everyone. I sincerely hope that your classes with respect to the portion taken up by Piyush sir and Sunil sir has gone on well. I've been told that few classes are still remaining. I think एक पीयूष सर की बची है और 3-4 शायद सुनील सर की बची होंगी. In total, I guess the number of classes are going to exceed 60. एक मिनट, क्लास स्टार्ट करने से पहले थोड़ा सा कंफर्टेबल हो जाते हैं. लेट्स गेट अ लिटिल बिट कंफर्टेबल बिफोर वी स्टार्ट द क्लास. देखो, it doesn't and it should not take these many classes to cover one subject. Certainly it should not. You are first and second batch, RB1 and 2 हो आप लोग. आपके केस में हमारे पास बैंडविड्थ है, as in your batch started in the month of February, I think February and March में start हुआ है आपका बैच. आपकी क्लास केस में हमारे पास थोड़ी सी बैंडविड्थ है with respect to that we can extend the total number of classes to let's say about 300 classes. 300 दिन आपकी क्लास या even more than 300 we can extend. जब हम पढ़ रहे होते हैं क्लास में, when we are studying in the class, when we are attending classes, our objective as students is to grab as much as we can and also to make sure that the teacher teaches us all the subjects in complete detail. Also, we expect, for example, dictation of notes from the teacher. At the same time, we must realize this thing that this causes a delay in completion of syllabus. बेसिक इकोनॉमिक्स की प्रॉब्लम हमने डिस्कस भी करी थी जब हमने बेसिक कॉन्सेप्ट्स वाला टॉपिक पढ़ा था, दैट द अमाउंट ऑफ रिसोर्सेज आर लिमिटेड whereas the desires are unlimited. Number of classes that ideally should be taken up for completion of the subject are quite less. But when you include, for example, teaching many topics in detail, when you include dictation part which takes up twice the time, then certainly the number of classes increase. As far as you people are concerned, I think you should not be worried. आपको worried नहीं होना चाहिए because you are in a good state as far as starting of your batch took place. Your course would be completed well before time. I sincerely hope so that I think it should be completed well before time. As in up till let's say February तक मेरे ख्याल से आपका कोर्स complete हो जाना चाहिए. February तक I think it should be a rational timeline to expect that your course, entire as in सारे subjects आपके January February तक complete हो जाने चाहिए. But as far as other batches are concerned, this becomes a problem. आपके बैच में इतनी प्रॉब्लम नहीं है, बाकी बैचेस में प्रॉब्लम हो जाएगी. लेकिन again, the mode of teaching is such, the requirements of teaching are such that our expectations are a little bit different as compared to the resources what we have. Anyways, I sincerely believe and I hope as well as I believe that coverage of topics as far as your batch is concerned has not been compromised in any way. Coverage as well as understanding. अगर coverage बहुत comprehensive हुई है आपके batch में और understanding teachers have spent, I have tried my best, I have tried to ensure that you understand all the topics which I have taught you and I'm sure other teachers would also have tried. If coverage of topics has been comprehensive and you have been able to understand with a decent level of understanding, then I think there is nothing to worry about. फिर आप लोग चिंता मत करो, कोर्स आप लोगों का तो एटलीस्ट टाइम पे हो ही जाएगा, एज इन नॉट इन द टाइमलाइन दैट यू एक्सपेक्टेड और वी एक्सपेक्टेड, बट अ लिटिल बिट स्ट्रेच टाइमलाइन। अगर कवरेज पूरी हो रही है, कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव हो रही है, काफी सारी चीजें हो रही हैं, प्लस beyond that you are also able to understand, then it's fine. I think that's a acceptable compromise that both of us can make. I can take more classes, as in Vision IES can provide more classes and you can attend more classes, as long as it's being completed with a decent timeline, decently acceptable timeline, when the coverage is good and understanding is good. I think that is how we should look at it. Start करते हैं from where we left last time. Prehistoric days में हमारी क्लास हुई थी. The last topic that we were covering was banking. One last part in banking was remaining, and then the topic of fiscal policy or government budgeting remains. This is what I'll be covering. I expect to cover it in about 4 to 5 classes. Let's see how much does it take. Thankfully, because now Piyush sir and Sunil sir have taken some of the classes, therefore understanding of some of those topics that I'm going to teach would be greater, therefore helping me to teach a little bit faster. Let's start. तो हमने लास्ट चीज जो डिस्कस करी थी वो बैंकिंग थी. इन बैंकिंग आई जस्ट क्विकली रीकैप व्हाट वी डिस्कस्ड. बैंकिंग में हमने डिस्कस किया था हेल्थ ऑफ बैंक्स. हेल्थ ऑफ बैंक्स में हमने डिस्कस किया था द स्ट्रेटेजी टू करेक्ट एनपीए प्रॉब्लम. व्हाट वर एनपीएस? वी डिस्कस्ड एनपीएस, नॉन परफॉर्मिंग एसेट्स. बैंक्स हैव गिवन लोन टू समबडी एंड दैट लोन हैज नॉट कम बैक. दैट बिकम्स एन एनपीए. Technical definitions, I hope you have written down. You will be able to remember them once you revise your notes. 90 days NPA. A loan has been given by the bank and it hasn't come back to the bank. That becomes an NPA, impacting the health of bank. How does it impact health of the bank? We discussed the concept of CRAR, capital to risk weighted asset ratio, or CAR, capital adequacy ratio. क्या था capital adequacy ratio में? If I am a bank and I have to do business, my business is taking deposits and lending money. In order to lend money, I must have some money of my own as well. अपना पैसा, capital. I must have some capital of my own as well. Why? Because if I lend depositors money, अगर मैं depositor का पैसा लेके lend कर देता हूं, then entire risk is borne by depositor, not by me. Depositor का पैसा है जो लोन पे दिया है. अगर depositor का पैसा ही लोन पे देना, if I have to give depositor money on loan, then what is my incentive to ensure that the loan is repaid back? अगर पैसा चला भी गया तो मेरा तो कोई लॉस नहीं हुआ. Therefore, in order to ensure that I am also involved in recovery of that loan, there is a requirement of capital. I must possess some capital of my own. Discuss किया था हमने ये चीज capital requirements में. If the number of loans which I have given, out of them some are not repaying me back, I will have to allocate an equivalent amount of capital, for some amount of capital for those loans. Therefore, the amount of capital available with me, कुछ capital अब मैंने उन loans के लिए क्या कर दी? Provision. We use the word provisioning. We understood what provisioning was. I have provisioned some amount of money for the loans which I have given. More amount of money has been provisioned for loans which have not been repaid. Therefore, the amount of my own money, that is my capital, that remains with me has reduced. Hence, my ability to give loan reduces. ये हमने discuss किया था. Then we discussed, this was capital aspect, capital requirements वाला aspect. There must be, banks must be adequately capitalized. We discussed recovery part. In that recovery or improvement of health part, we discussed the 4 R's strategy. 4 R's में first R क्या था? Recognition of the problem. Second R was resolution of the problem. Fourth R was recapitalization of banks, and third R was recapitalization of bank, and fourth R was reform in the banking system. तो पहले 2 R हमने डिस्कस किए थे. फर्स्ट R recognition, AQR डिस्कस किया था हमने. आई एम जस्ट रिकैपिंग. आई नो दैट यू माइट नॉट रिमेंबर दीज थिंग्स. बहुत पहले डिस्कस किया था, आपको याद नहीं होगा, इसलिए मैं फटाफट रिकैप कर रहा हूं. पूरा तो ऑब्वियसली नहीं कर पाएंगे. फर्स्ट R was recognition, AQR, asset quality review. You recognize how much of problem exists in your books. Recognize how many loans are bad. Stress loans को जो आपने evergreen कर रखा है, the loans which you have evergreened, as in not recognized as NPAs, start recognizing those loans as NPAs now. First was recognize the extent of problem. First R. Second R was recover. First you recognize the problem, then you recover those loans. Solve that issue, resolve that issue. इन दैट वी डिस्कस्ड डेट ट्राइब्यूनल्स, हमने डिस्कस किया था डीआरटी, डेट रिकवरी ट्राइब्यूनल वाली एक्ट. वी डिस्कस्ड सारफेसी एक्ट, सिक्योरिटाइजेशन एंड एसेट रिकंस्ट्रक्शन एंड एनफोर्समेंट ऑफ सिक्योरिटी इंटरेस्ट. सारफेसी एक्ट डिस्कस करी थी हमने. सिक्योरिटाइजेशन ऑफ एसेट्स, रिकंस्ट्रक्शन ऑफ एसेट, एनफोर्समेंट ऑफ सिक्योरिटी इंटरेस्ट ऑफ बैंक्स, सारफेसी एक्ट डिस्कस करी थी. देन वी डिस्कस्ड मैकेनिज्म सच एज डेट रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग, सस्टेनेबल डेट रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग हमने डिस्कस करी थी. रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग मीन्स सिंपली रीनेगोशिएटिंग द टर्म्स ऑफ रीपेमेंट. दैट इज व्हाट रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग इज. मैंने आपको लोन दिया है, आप वापस नहीं कर पा रहे हो, अब हम दोनों रीनेगोशिएट करेंगे टर्म्स ऑफ रीपेमेंट. हाउ विल यू रीपे बैक? Will interest change? Will the timeline of repayment change? All these things. This is what restructuring was. We discussed IBC, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Last class में हमने discuss किया था. Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, it is a set of laws that allow banks to recover their loans, the money which they have given, quickly. Not just banks, but any creditor. आईबीसी केवल बैंक्स को ही एनेबल नहीं करता है. आईबीसी डजंट जस्ट एनेबल बैंक्स टू रिकवर द अमाउंट ऑफ मनी व्हिच दे हैव लेंड. आईबीसी एनेबल्स एनी क्रेडिटर. वी डिस्कस्ड ऑपरेशनल एंड फाइनेंशियल क्रेडिटर्स. ऑपरेशनल मतलब आई हैव प्रोवाइडेड मटीरियल टू यू. यू आर अ बिल्डिंग, यू आर अ रेजिडेंशियल कंस्ट्रक्शन कंपनी, सोसाइटी कंस्ट्रक्ट करते हो, बिल्डर हो आप, और मैंने आपको मटीरियल प्रोवाइड करा है, आपने मुझे मटीरियल का पैसा नहीं दिया. आई हैव गिवन यू ब्रिक्स, यू हैव नॉट पेड मी फॉर ब्रिक्स. I can initiate insolvency proceedings against you. Bank can initiate insolvency proceedings against you. Your employees can initiate insolvency proceeding against you if you have not paid their salary. Labor who is working can initiate insolvency proceeding against you if you have not paid their wages. You can yourself initiate insolvency proceedings, as in you can yourself give an application to declare your firm as insolvent. आप अपने आप भी कर सकते हो. Various entities which can initiate insolvency proceedings. What happens in an insolvency proceedings? First, a creditor gives an application to NCLT, National Company Law Tribunal. NCLT will review the application first. Reviewing essentially means NCLT will ask the person कि भाई please pay back the money that you owe to this person. I am the defaulter and there is some creditor, bank. NCLT will ask the defaulter to repay money to the bank. Otherwise, we will admit the case in NCLT. हम NCLT में केस को admit कर लेंगे. Insolvency proceedings will start against you if you do not pay back. Warning. Once insolvency proceedings start, क्या होता है next step? Next step was the management is kicked out. Management is kicked out as in whoever the management was, the owner was, they are kicked out and a new management takes their position. Some special professionals called insolvency and resolution professionals, they take over management of the company. The task of these insolvency and resolution professionals is, number one, to manage the company for as long as it is in this insolvency proceeding, and second, to prepare a resolution plan. कंपनी को मैनेज करना जब तक वो इंसॉल्वेंसी प्रोसीडिंग में है. सेकंड, टू प्रिपेयर अ रेजोल्यूशन प्लान फॉर दिस कंपनी. Resolution plan is presented to committee of creditors who may either accept or reject within a time period of 180 plus 90 days grace period. If the plan is not accepted, then assets are liquidated. ये भी डिस्कस किया था हमने. Liquidated मतलब means assets are sold off. To what extent? To the extent of settlement of liability. मैंने मटेरियल दिया था आपको एंड द कॉस्ट ऑफ मटेरियल वाज, आई प्रोवाइडेड सीमेंट टू यू, कॉस्ट ऑफ सीमेंट वाज 4 करोड़ रुपीस. सोसाइटी की कीमत 100 करोड़ रुपए है, मेरा ड्यू 4 करोड़ रुपए है, मेरे ऊपर ड्यू आपका 4 करोड़ रुपए, तो 4 करोड़ रुपए के एसेट्स बेच दिए जाएंगे. 4 करोड़ रुपीस वर्थ ऑफ एसेट्स वुड बी सोल्ड एंड आई विल बी पेड ऑफ. दिस इज हाउ इंसॉल्वेंसी केस इज रिजॉल्व्ड. This was under IBC, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. The latest development in the latest development in resolution of bad assets, stressed assets. Next hour, अब यहां से हम start करेंगे. Next 2 hours are remaining. ये दो last, just this part of banking remains, and then we'll start with a discussion on government budgeting or fiscal policy. The next 2 hours remain. They are recapitalization and reforms. Let's quickly discuss what recapitalization is and then what reforms. Reforms तो 2 minute की चीज है. Reforms and recapitalization. Let's quickly discuss. recapitalization. Recapitalization. क्या मतलब वो recapitalization का है? Try to understand English language word. Recapitalize, that means provide capital again. Provide capital. Provide capital. Somebody who doesn't have adequate amount of capital, give capital to them. That is what is meant by recapitalization. Banks need capital. Banks need capital. There must be capital with the bank so that they can continue their operations. They can continue their operations. Money should be available with bank which belongs to them, capital, so that they can continue their operation. Operation of borrowing, and borrowing as in taking deposits and lending that money. Capital. If banks do not have adequate capital, they will not be able to carry on with their operations. Banks cannot lend money if they do not have adequate amount of capital. Banks may have large amount of deposits. Banks may have large amount of deposits, but unless they have capital with them, they will not be able to carry out lending operations. Why? Because we have seen in our CRAR, capital to risk weighted asset ratio, क्या थी? Capital upon risk weighted assets, RWA, risk weighted assets. Essentially RWA क्या है? Loans. This is equals to loans, risk weighted loans. Capital upon loans. You have to maintain CRAR at 9%. Basel III norms, you have to maintain CRAR at 9%. Capital upon, I am writing loans so that you are able to understand better. ये लोन नहीं है, यहां पे डिनोमिनेटर में रिस्क वेटेड एसेट है. प्लीज डिस्टिंक्शन ध्यान रखना. आई एम राइटिंग लोन्स इन डिनोमिनेटर so that you are able to understand it. It's easy to understand, but for technically correct purposes, it is RWA, risk weighted asset, which is there in denominator. Capital upon loans should be at least equal to 9%. Therefore, capital at least equal to 9% मतलब greater than equal to. Capital upon loans, risk weighted asset should at least be 9%, मतलब 9% से ज्यादा होनी चाहिए, minimum 9%. Therefore, capital with the bank should at least be 9% of their loans. 9% of their loans. Or loans at max should be capital upon 9%. At max, the amount of loan that the bank can give. At max, the amount of loan that the bank can give should be capital upon 9%. अगर बैंक के पास, if the bank has a capital of 1,000 rupees, अगर 1,000 रुपए की कैपिटल है बैंक के पास, कैपिटल अपॉन लोन ये 9% के बराबर होना चाहिए. इसका मतलब लोन कितना हो सकता है? At max, the amount of loan that the bank can give is capital upon 9%. 1,000 upon 9%. This is the maximum amount of loan that the bank can give. About 9,000 rupees. लगभग 9,000 रुपए. लगभग 11,000 रुपए. लगभग 11,000 रुपए. About 11,000 rupees. 9 into 11, 99. About 11,000 rupees is the maximum amount of loan that the bank can give. Amount of loan that the bank can give is capped by amount of capital available with the bank. Therefore, even if bank may have deposits, it will not be able to lend if it doesn't have adequate amount of capital. अगर capital नहीं है तो बैंक डिपॉजिट भी है, डिपॉजिट होते हुए भी lend नहीं कर पाएगा. What happened after demonetization? After demonetization, banks received lot of deposits with them. Everybody deposited their money with the banks during demonetization. What was NPA situation in the year 2016, 17, 18? NPAs were at their peak. NPAs started to rise. Discuss किया था हमने. NPAs started to rise after AQR, asset quality review, when you started to recognize. AQR 2014 में start हुआ. NPAs peaked in the year 2017. बैंक के एनपीएस लगभग 16-17% के आसपास हो गए. दे पीक्ड अराउंड 2017. Amount of NPAs, amount of loans of the banks which had become NPA became very high. Therefore, the amount of capital which was used for provisioning also became very high. Hence, the amount of capital which was now left with the bank became low. Amount of deposits after demonetization increased drastically, exponentially increased. Despite an increase in deposits, banks could not lend. Why could banks not lend? Banks could not lend because they did not have adequate capital. They were not adequately capitalized. I'll recap the events. In 2014, AQR starts asset quality review. Because of asset quality reviews, NPAs start rising. NPAs start rising, therefore, amount of capital which the banks have starts to reduce. Why? Because more assets recognized as NPA, you need more capital to provision against them. आपके पास 100 रुपए थे, अब 100 रुपए में से 50 रुपए आपकी कैपिटल प्रोविजनिंग में लग गई, तो आपके पास बची कितनी? केवल 50 रुपए कैपिटल बची. Therefore, banks were stressed. They could not maintain the required capital adequacy ratio of 9%. If banks could not maintain required capital adequacy ratio of 9%, therefore, they could not lend. After demonetization, many people deposited their money in the banks. Despite there being lot of money with the banks, despite that, banks could not lend. Why? पैसा होते हुए भी lend नहीं कर सकते क्योंकि capital नहीं है. Problem of banking system in the economy is that there are high NPAs. We can talk about resolving NPAs, but NPAs will resolve in a longer timeline. NPA को resolve करना लंबे दूरी का खेल है. लेकिन इकोनॉमी में पैसा देना, क्रेडिट देना, that is required always. If banks cannot give credit in the economy, then the requirement of credit of the economy will not be fulfilled. People who need money, who need loan, they will not be able to take loans. If people cannot take loans, then there will not be adequate amount of money with the people for spending. If people cannot spend money in the economy, then producers will not be able to sell their goods. If they are unable to sell their goods, economy will start to slow down. I'll repeat this chain of events again. If banks do not have enough capital, then banks are unable to lend. If banks are unable to lend, people will not be able to borrow. Those who need, when they are not able to borrow, therefore they will not be able to spend. Spending in the economy will decrease. If spending in the economy will decrease, therefore producers will not be able to produce goods. Why? Because there is no demand for their goods. There is no demand for their goods, hence economy starts to decline. Economic growth rate starts to decline because of poor health of banking system. This is how economy and banks are linked. Health of banks is really important for health of economy. The problem is that NPAs will resolve in a longer time frame, but capital is required immediately. You need to attack both the NPA problem as well as capital inadequacy problem simultaneously. NPA problem कैसे resolve करनी है? We have discussed IBC and all those things we have discussed. But capital adequacy की problem अभी भी solve नहीं हुई है. Let's see how is capital adequacy problem solved. Banks are, as we have seen, undercapitalized. Undercapitalized. Undercapitalized का मतलब क्या हुआ? Adequate amount of capital is not available with the banking system. In order to provide adequate amount of capital to the banking system, there are various ways. Various ways of providing capital क्या है? One way of capitalizing bank is direct infusion of capital. Direct infusion of capital. That is one way. And second is indirect infusion. Indirect infusion. There are two ways of providing capital to the banks: direct infusion of capital and indirect infusion of capital. What is direct infusion of capital? Direct infusion का मतलब है that government gives money to the banks directly. Government is the owner of public sector banks. Government, by virtue of being the owner, ध्यान से सुनना, डायरेक्ट और इनडायरेक्ट, क्योंकि डायरेक्ट सुनोगे तभी इनडायरेक्ट समझ में आएगा. प्लीज पे अटेंशन. गवर्नमेंट बाय वर्च्यू ऑफ बीइंग द ओनर कैन गिव मनी टू इट्स बिजनेस. मैं ओनर हूं अपने बिजनेस का, मैं अपने बिजनेस में जितना पैसा लगाऊं लगा सकता हूं, जितना पैसा लगाना है लगा सकता हूं. मेरा बिजनेस, मेरे 50 अलग अलग बिजनेस है. मैं एक बिजनेस में, आई डोंट गिव एडिक्वेट अमाउंट ऑफ मनी टू वन बिजनेस एंड दैट वन बिजनेस स्टार्ट्स टू फेल. If I want, if I desire, I can provide any amount of money to that business. Why? Because I am an owner. So one way is government directly gives money to the bank by virtue of being the owner. By virtue of being the owner. I'm using the word owner a little bit liberally. By virtue of being the largest shareholder. Part owner, largest owner. By virtue of being the owner, government can infuse money within the bank. Government can give money directly to banks which it owns and ask them to use this money for capital purposes. Government will say to SBI, take 20,000 crore rupees. I am going to make a budgetary allocation. Budgetary allocation. Government will say, I am going to make a budgetary allocation. Budget में मैं decide कर, I'll announce in the budget that I am allocating 20,000 crore rupees for SBI to recapitalize itself. Simply, मैं SBI को 20,000 करोड़ रुपए दे दूंगा. Government will give 20,000 crore rupees to SBI and SBI will use that money as capital. SBI का अपना पैसा हो गया, सरकार का था, सरकार ने SBI को दिया, SBI का पैसा हो गया. Simply direct infusion. Direct infusion of capital by virtue of being the owner. Budgetary allocation. Similarly, direct allocation can also be done in another manner. Direct allocation can also be done in, direct की बात कर रहा हूं, direct allocation can also be done in another manner. One is budgetary announcement. Second is dilution of equity. Dilution of equity. Equity मतलब ownership. Let's say SBI. In SBI, Government of India has about 75% ownership. 75% शेयर सरकार के पास है और लगभग 25% शेयर बाकी लोगों के पास है. Public and other institutions, they collectively hold about 25% share. So 75% of ownership of SBI is with government. Government wants money so that it can give money to SBI. Maybe government doesn't have adequate amount of money so that it can give a budgetary allocation. I'll repeat. One way of giving capital directly to SBI is simply government says in the budget that we are going to give this much money to SBI. But for that, there needs to be amount of money with government so that it can give that allocation. सरकार के पास वैसे ही पैसा नहीं है. अब सरकार के पास अगर वैसे ही पैसा नहीं है तो सरकार पैसा कहां से लेके आएगी? सरकार पैसा लेके आएगी अपनी हिस्सेदारी बेच के. Government will get money to infuse in SBI by selling its ownership in SBI. Dilution of equity. Government will sell some part of its ownership in SBI to somebody who is willing. Anybody who is willing will offload it in the market to general public anyway, any which way. Government will do some kind of disinvestment. Disinvestment. Government will do some kind of disinvestment. It will receive money when it disinvests. जब disinvestment करेगी तो government will receive money. Now this money will be used by government to infuse capital back into SBI. Either it can infuse directly by budgetary process or it can infuse directly by dilution of equity. Equity बेचो, अपना asset बेचो और पैसा directly bank को दे दो. Two broad ways in which direct infusion of capital is done. Second is indirect infusion of capital. What happens in indirect infusion of capital? In indirect infusion of capital, the process is similar. Government will give money to SBI directly also, but from where government arranges that money is a little bit different. I'll repeat. Direct infusion में क्या है? Government directly gives money to SBI. Either budgetary support के through announce कर दिया या फिर equity बेची अपनी, share, sell its shares, get money and give that money to SBI. In this indirect infusion, arrangement of money is done a little bit differently. In this indirect infusion, here also government will give money directly to SBI. यहां पे भी सरकार SBI को पैसा डायरेक्टली ही देगी, लेकिन पैसा लाएगी कहां से? Where it will it get that money? That is a little bit tricky part. Let's see how does government indirectly infuses. It is done through the process of recapitalization bonds. Recapitalization bonds. Recap bonds. This is done through the process of recapitalization bonds. Bonds फिर आ गए. Bonds हमने बहुत डिटेल में डिस्कस भी किए थे, काफी टाइम स्पेंड किया. Bonds. What is a bond? Simply a debt instrument. Everybody knows what a bond is. Government borrows money from me. That bond is simply a proof that government has borrowed money from me. ये है bond. Government wants 100 rupees. I have given 100 rupees to the government. In return, government has given me a piece of paper. On that piece of paper, it is written that government has borrowed 100 rupees, will pay me an interest of 10% for 2 years, for which it has borrowed that money. That is a bond. Simply a proof. Recapitalization bonds. Government will issue recap bonds. Government issues recap bonds. एक स्पेशल टाइप के बॉन्ड्स जिनका नाम है रिकैपिटलाइजेशन. दीज आर स्पेशल टाइप ऑफ बॉन्ड्स विच आर नेम्ड रिकैपिटलाइजेशन बॉन्ड्स. दैट मीन्स देयर ऑब्जेक्टिव इज रिकैपिटलाइजेशन. गवर्नमेंट इशूज रिकैप बॉन्ड्स, नंबर 1. Number 2, these recapitalization bonds are not sold to general public or RBI. When government borrows money via bonds, how does it borrow money? Either it sells bond to RBI or it sells bonds in the market as in to general everybody. यहां पे सरकार इन bonds को general जनता को नहीं देगी. It will not launch these bonds in general market. It will not launch these bonds. It will not sell these bonds to RBI, not sell these bonds in general. The sale of these bonds will be very specific. Government issues recap bonds. These bonds are sold to the banks. These bonds are sold to the banks. These bonds, recap bonds, bank को sell किए सरकार ने. Now, if you remember what we discussed in our last class, which is a little bit more for me to expect, even though थोड़ा बहुत मैं आपसे expect करूंगा, मैं आपको बताऊंगा भी. जब हमने risk weighted assets calculate किए थे, when we calculated risk weighted asset, आपको याद है, we have got person 1, person 2, person 3, and there is some risk associated with each of these persons. Person 1 को a bank lends 1000 rupees, 1000 रुपए बैंक को person 1 ने lend किए, बैंक ने person 1 को lend किए. Let us say there is a 50% risk, 50% risk. Therefore, risk weighted asset कितना हो गया? Risk weighted asset is 50% of 1000, that is 500 rupees. 500 रुपए इसका risk weighted asset हो गया. Provisioning. Bank has to provision in accordance with its risk weighted asset. मान लो 2% provisioning करनी है. 2% of risk weighted asset has to be provisioned. Therefore 2% of 500 कितना हुआ? 10 rupees. 10 रुपए बैंक को provision करने पड़ेंगे. Provision means set aside from its capital. Set aside from its capital. I'll recap this process again so that you remember. We have discussed this process in our last class when we discussed the concept of risk weighted assets. We discussed a normal balance sheet of a bank. A bank lends money to people. Each person has a certain risk associated with the money which you are giving to that person. Bank has lent 1000 rupees to one person and there is a 50% risk associated with that person. Therefore, the risk weighted asset is 1000, the value of asset, multiplied by risk. Risk weighted asset is 1000 into 50%, which is 500 rupees. 500 हो गया risk weighted asset. और risk weighted asset का कुछ proportion आपको provision करना है. You have to provision from your own capital. You have to set aside some amount of money of your risk weighted asset from your own capital for this particular loan. आपने 1000 रुपए का लोन दिया. You have given a loan of 1000 rupees. 10 rupees you have to set aside from your capital. 1,000 का लोन 10 रुपए अपनी कैपिटल से सेट असाइड करने पड़ेंगे. यू हैव टू सेट असाइड 10 रुपीज फ्रॉम योर ओन कैपिटल. 10,000 रुपीज ये लोन कहां से दिया? 1,000 रुपीज ऑफ लोन कहां से दिया आपने? फ्रॉम योर डिपॉजिट्स. रिस्क कितना है? 50%. रिस्क वेटेड एसेट कितना है? 500 रुपीज. प्रोविजनिंग कितनी है? 2%. 2% ऑफ दिस रिस्क वेटेड एसेट विच इज 10 rupees. You have to set aside 10 rupees from your own capital. To recap quickly, if bank doesn't have adequate amount of capital, then bank will not be able to give this loan. Bank के पास deposit तो है. Bank has adequate amount of deposit, but bank does not have 10 rupees of capital. 10 रुपए capital नहीं है बैंक के पास. अगर 10 रुपए capital नहीं है बैंक के पास, तो क्या बैंक ये लोन दे पाएगा? Will bank be able to give this loan if it doesn't have 10 rupees capital? It has 1,000 rupees to be lent, but it does not have these 10 rupees from its own capital. Will it be able to give loan? No, it will not be. Why? Because bank doesn't possess adequate amount of capital. यही तो हम एड्रेस कर रहे हैं, कैपिटलाइजेशन पार्ट ही हम एड्रेस कर रहे हैं यहां पे. वी आर ट्राइंग टू एंश्योर दैट बैंक हैज एडिक्वेट अमाउंट ऑफ कैपिटल विद इट. नाउ हैविंग अंडरस्टूड दिस, नाउ लेट्स गो बैक टू अवर रीकैप बॉन्ड्स. गवर्नमेंट इश्यूज रीकैप बॉन्ड्स, रीकैपिटलाइजेशन बॉन्ड्स. These bonds are sold to the banks. ये bonds बैंक को सेल होंगे. Bonds are sold to the bank. Bonds are a proof that a loan has been taken by someone. When a bank buys government bonds, it is essentially lending that money to government. When bank buys, these bonds are sold to banks. Banks are buying these bonds. Government is selling these bonds to the bank. When a bank buys these government bonds, then that means bank is lending money to government. बैंक एक पर्सन 4 है जो कि गवर्नमेंट को मनी लेंड कर रहा है. Let's say value of this bond is 1,000 rupees again. This 1,000 rupees is lent by bank to the government, and this 1,000 rupees will have some risk weighted asset and will need some provisioning just like any other loan. लेकिन गवर्नमेंट के केस में एक खास बात है. वो खास बात यह है कि गवर्नमेंट के केस में रिस्क 0% है. By definition, the risk associated with lending to government is 0%. What does 0% risk signifies? That there is no risk at all in lending money to government. There is no risk at all. You give money to government, it will definitely come back with interest. Bank has lent these 1,000 rupees through these bonds, recap bonds, to government. One. Second, there is zero risk associated with lending to government. Since there is zero risk associated with lending to government, therefore there is zero provisioning which is required. Total provisioning required against this loan is 0. Hence, lending to government does not create any burden on capital. Lending to government does not create any burden on capital. Banks do not need any money to set aside against a loan given to the government. Why? Because risk associated with government is 0%. सरकार को पैसा कहां से मिला? बैंक्स से पैसा मिल गया. Government gets money from banks. Whose money was this? This is depositors' money. Bank is lending to government depositors' money. Depositors' money is liability of the bank. Bank is using its liability, that is depositors' money, and giving that to government. When it gives to government, it becomes bank's asset. Government now has loan that it has taken from bank. For bank, it was liability. Government now has 1,000 rupees. The purpose of these bonds was recap. Government now has 1,000 rupees. It will give these 1,000 rupees back to the bank. ये 1,000 रुपए सरकार ने बैंक से बोरो किए और वापस बैंक को दे दिए. It borrows from the bank by virtue of being the government. By virtue of being the government, its borrowing is zero risk. By virtue of being the government, by virtue of lending to the government, bank has to set aside zero amount of money. bank lends to government. By virtue of being the owner, it gives this money back to the bank for recapitalization. वापस से पैसा बैंक को दे दी कि सरकार कि अब इसको अपनी कैपिटल की तरह यूज करो. यूज दिस मनी एज कैपिटल. क्या बैंक बिना गवर्नमेंट के इस मनी को कैपिटल की तरह यूज कर सकता था? Could bank use this money without government intervention in form of capital? No. Why? This money is liability, not capital. ये पैसा बैंक का डिपॉजिटर्स को दिया हुआ, डिपॉजिटर के द्वारा दिया गया पैसा है. Depositors have given 1,000 rupees to the bank. Bank's liability is 1,000. Banks cannot use this liability in form of its capital. But banks can lend this liability to government, and lending to government entails zero risk. Since banks lend to government, therefore there is a zero amount of provisioning that banks have to do. Hence, no burden on capital. Since no provisioning has to be done with respect to this loan, government receives this money and bank doesn't provision anything. Now government has 1,000. Government will give this 1,000 back to the bank as capital. जैसे यहां पे बजटरी सपोर्ट दे रही थी या फिर इक्विटी सेल करके दे रही थी, यहां पे दोबारा से सरकार 1,000 रुपए बैंक को दे देगी. टेक दिस 1,000 rupees and use it as your capital. Liability of bank now is turning into its capital. It cannot turn it into capital directly, but by lending it to government and government giving it back to the bank by virtue of being the owner, it has essentially turned its liability into its capital. This is what recapitalization is. This is how recapitalization bonds work. Recap bond, recapitalization of banks. Recapitalization done in three ways we have discussed, or two broad ways, direct and indirect, either through budgetary support or dilution of equity or through recap bonds. Please write down, likho. Write down. Give heading recapitalization. Give heading recapitalization. Write down. Recapitalization is the third part of improving the health of banks. The third part of improving the health of the banks. Full stop. It entails recapitalization. It entails capitalizing the banks adequately, capitalizing the banks adequately so that they can lend to the economy, so that they can lend to the economy. Full stop. Even if banks have adequate deposits, even if banks have adequate deposits, comma, they won't be able to lend. They won't be able to lend because they won't be able to lend unless, they won't be able to lend unless they are adequately capitalized. Unless they are adequately capitalized due to the limitations imposed by the regulatory framework, ब्रैकेट में लिख लो CRAR requirement. CRAR requirement. Also, capitalization of public sector banks. Capitalization of public sector banks is needed due to their poor health, and because of their importance in the economy, dash लगा के लिखो. If banks are unable to lend, comma, economy apostrophe s, economy's demand would decrease, and therefore the output also, full stop. The economy will start to decline. Next paragraph. Recapitalization is done in the following three ways. Number one, infusion of capital through budgetary support. Dash लगा के लिखो. Government by virtue of being the owner, gives money to the banks for capitalization purpose. Government by virtue of being the owner gives money to the banks for capitalization purpose. Second, dilution of equity. Dash लगा के लिखो. Government may sell its ownership. To the extent government may sell its ownership to the extent it wants to get money to give for recapitalization. To the extent it wants to get money for recapitalization. Wants to get money, it gives for recapitalization. For recapitalization. Full stop. Third, through recapitalization bonds. देखो, in this method the government issues recap bonds. In this method the government issues recap bonds to the banks full stop. Banks buy them from government, comma, lending to the government, the amount which the government seeks. Lending to the government the amount which the government seeks. Full stop. Since it is government it is government to whom the banks have lent, since it is government to whom the banks have lent, comma, there is no requirement of capital. There is no requirement of capital for provisioning purpose, as there is zero risk associated with government lending. As there is zero risk associated with government lending. Full stop. The government, by virtue of being the owner, the government, by virtue of being the owner, gives this money back to the bank, gives this money back to the bank to be used for capitalization purpose. To be used for capitalization purpose. Full stop. नेक्स्ट लाइन में लिखना स्टार मार्क करके, इन दिस रीकैप बॉन्ड्स प्रोसेस, इन दिस रीकैप बॉन्ड्स प्रोसेस, essentially the liability of the banks, ब्रैकेट में डिपॉजिट्स is being converted to its capital, through lending and receiving back from the government. Through lending to and receiving back. Through lending to and receiving back from the government. Full stop. मुझे लगता है सबको समझ में आ गया होगा रिकैपिटलाइजेशन बॉन्ड्स का प्रोसेस. आई होप इट्स क्लियर टू एवरीवन द प्रोसेस ऑफ रिकैप बॉन्ड्स. द फाइनल आर इज रिफॉर्म्स. प्लीज राइट रिफॉर्म्स. राइट, गिव हेडिंग. लास्ट फोर्थ आर इज रिफॉर्म्स. राइट डाउन. इसमें कुछ समझाने का नहीं है, मैं लिखवाऊंगा, अपने आप समझ में आ जाएगा सब कुछ. रिफॉर्म्स. राइट डाउन रिफॉर्म. Reforms pertain to, please write, reforms pertain to general steps which can be taken to improve the functioning and governance of banks. To improve the functioning and governance of banks. Full stop. The idea is to make PSBs, public sector banks. देखो प्राइवेट सेक्टर बैंक्स की भी शॉर्ट फॉर्म PSB बनेगी, लेकिन जब हम PSB यूज करते हैं तो दैट इज यूज फॉर पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक्स. ठीक है. द आइडिया इज टू the idea is to make the PSBs professional in their operations, and competitive at par with private sector, and competitive at par with private sector for improvement of their health, for improvement of their health and thus economy, and thus the economy. Full stop. This is sought to be achieved. This is sought to be achieved by reforming the relationship between the owner and the entity, by reforming the relationship between the owner and the entity, that is government and the PSB, that is government and the PSB. Full stop. To reform, it is required to reduce the intervention, of government in working of the bank, to reduce the intervention of government in working of the bank, and thus slowly improve the work culture to a more professional one. Slowly improve the work culture to a more professional one. Full stop. Next paragraph में लिखो, for achieving this, it has been proposed, to increase the distance between government, that is the owner, and the bank, that is the entity. Increase the distance between government, that is the owner, and bank, that is the entity. Full stop. It is sought to be achieved. By setting up a BHC. It is sought to be achieved by setting up a BHC. ब्रैकेट में बैंक होल्डिंग कंपनी. तो स्टॉप. A BHC will hold the ownership of banks directly. The BHC will hold the ownership of banks directly, and government will hold the ownership of BHC. And government will hold the ownership of BHC. Dash, therefore, from directly being the owner, government will become the indirect owner. From being the direct owner, comma, government will become the indirect owner, comma, expecting to reduce direct intervention. Full stop. In the meantime, a BBB, ब्रैकेट में Bank Board Bureau. In the meantime, a BBB, Bank Board Bureau, has been set up, which is responsible to take certain decisions such as appointments to senior levels in PSBs, thereby reducing the direct influence of Ministry of Finance, that is government, bracket में लिख लो, that is government. This is about reforms. आसान है, मेरे बहुत आसान है. Reforms is simply reforming the manner of governance. Increase the distance between owner and the company. अगर ओनर और कंपनी के बीच में डिस्टेंस नहीं है, ओनर विल कीप ऑन इंटरफेयरिंग. इसको अपॉइंट करो, इसको लोन दो, so on so forth. Owner will keep on interfering. Increase the distance. How do you increase the distance? Set up something in between. You have proposed to set up a BHC, bank holding company, in between. Government, rather than owning the bank directly, will own them indirectly through a bank holding company, BHC. Till the time BHC is not established, you increase the distance by setting an interface in between. Rather than Ministry of Finance taking decisions for the banks, it will be a Bank Board Bureau. It is a Bank Board. Bank Board Bureau to functioning hai. A Bank Board Bureau was set up few years back, which now takes decision with respect to appointments and transfers of various senior positions in public sector banks. Reduce interference by increasing the distance. That is the reforms part. ठीक है? This is our discussion on banking. अब हम next topic start करेंगे government budgeting का. मनु चौधरी, काफी सारे क्वेश्चन पूछे हैं आपने. I think you emailed me as well. I think I had replied. मेरे ख्याल से रिप्लाई कर दिया होगा मैंने. I remember reading your mail. I sincerely hope I have replied to you. Manu's question is, sir, while recapitalizing, will all the shareholders give money as per their share as all are owners, or if government has share in any bank and it recapitalizes it, does the shareholding of government in the bank increases? No. देखो, Manu, please listen. This is the question that you have asked is a very natural question of an inquisitive mind, but at the same time this is a question which doesn't need an answer as far as this class is concerned. But still I'll give you. एक inquisitive question है, बहुत natural है. मुझे भी हुआ था question जब मैंने पहली बार देखा था, तो that is why I'm trying to answer this question. Question that Manu has asked is this: while recapitalizing, for example, government के पास 75% ownership है in a bank. Is only government required to give money to the bank, or are all shareholders required to give money? Number one. Second, if only government gives money, will it lead to increase in government shareholding? समझ गए होगे आप? जैसे 5 लोगों ने मिलके, 5 partners, they together set up a restaurant. 5 partners together set up a restaurant, and contribution of each partner is fixed. Each partner has given certain contribution and they receive certain shares in return. सबका 20-20% share है कंपनी में, उस रेस्टोरेंट में मान लो. Now, one partner says that I want to contribute more. इस रेस्टोरेंट को और कैपिटल की जरूरत है. This restaurant requires more capital. I want to contribute more. Will contribution be done equally by all 5 partners? If one partner contributes more, will it redistribute the ownership in the restaurant? जैसे मान लो मैं पार्टनर हूं और मैंने कंट्रीब्यूट किया, तो क्या अब मेरी ओनरशिप बढ़ के 30% हो जाएगी और बाकी लोगों की ओनरशिप टोटल मिला के पहले जो 80 थी अब वो 70 रह जाएगी? No. The answer is no to both questions. Any partner or any owner can contribute according to their own wish. I am not putting a pressure on others to contribute. There is no rule that says that if I contribute, then others would also have to contribute. No rule that says this. If I contribute, I am contributing on my own free will. When I am contributing, it doesn't mean that my shareholding will increase. My shareholding will increase only when I contribute conditionally. मैं कंडीशन लगा सकता हूं इस चीज की कि मैं तभी कंट्रीब्यूट करूंगा जब मेरे को शेयर होल्डिंग इंक्रीज करके मिलेगी. तो आई कैन गिव दिस कंडीशन, बट देयर इज नो नेसेसिटी हियर. आई एम लेट्स से अटैच्ड विद दैट रेस्टोरेंट, I may contribute more without expectation of an increase in my equity. Or if let's say others are not involved in the management, only I am involved in the management, I will say restaurant needs more money, I am going to give more money. But I will give more money only when all of you sell some part of your equity to me. तो मैं कंडीशनल कर सकता हूं, बट ऐसी कोई रिक्वायरमेंट नहीं है कि मेरे को कंडीशनल करना पड़े. I can give money out of my own free will. Government can give money by virtue of being the owner. In fact, the largest owner, government can give money. There is no requirement on others to contribute, number one, and government giving money will not increase government equity. I hope this is clear to everyone. Soham, in December, January, government issued zero coupon bonds to recapitalize Punjab and Sindh Bank, but these bonds were not issued at discount but at par. Is it not a loss for government and the economy and an economically unsound idea? Zero coupon bonds issued at par, not at a discount. देखो यहां पे हमने recap bonds की बात करी है. We have talked about recap bonds here. Bonds are issued to a bank and bank gives money to the government. Bank lends money to the government. Number one. Number two, government gives this money back to the bank. सरकार ने ये मनी पैसा वापस बैंक को दे दिया. अगर आप इसमें रियलाइज करो तो दो चीजें हैं. पहला, हु नीडेड मनी? बैंक नीडेड मनी. सेकंड, गवर्नमेंट इज प्रोवाइडिंग मनी बिकॉज गवर्नमेंट इज द ओनर एंड गवर्नमेंट इज कोट एंड कोट गवर्नमेंट. सरकार इसीलिए पैसा प्रोवाइड कर रही है क्योंकि सरकार की तरफ आप देख रहे हो. यू आर लुकिंग टू द गवर्नमेंट, भाई आप मेरे ओनर हो, कृपया करके मुझे पैसा दो. वाइल लेंडिंग आई वॉज नॉट वेरी केयरफुल, but now when things have gone bad, responsibility essentially is ultimately of the government. If banks collapse, then who will be questioned? Government will be questioned, not banks. कोई बैंक के मैनेजर को या बैंक के चेयरमैन को क्वेश्चन नहीं करने वाला है, सरकार को क्वेश्चन करने वाले हैं सब. So government knows that it is going to be held accountable. Therefore government will interfere. Nobody, I think I've made the point clear. Nobody is going to go after some employee of Punjab and Sindh Bank that it was you who gave loan to this person. आपका भाई भतीजा था या फिर आपका कोई जानने वाला था, आपने उसको लोन दे दिया. Nobody is going to ask them. Everybody is going to ask government that your governance was poor, your oversight was poor, therefore this bank has collapsed. तो क्वेश्चन सारा सरकार को पूछा जाएगा. सरकार क्या कर रही है? बाय वर्च्यू ऑफ बीइंग गवर्नमेंट, गवर्नमेंट बोरोज एट जीरो रिस्क. बाय वर्च्यू ऑफ बीइंग ओनर, गवर्नमेंट गिव्स बैक टू द बैंक दिस अमाउंट ऑफ मनी. हु नीड्स इट? बैंक नीड्स इट. हु इज परफॉर्मिंग द ड्यूटी? गवर्नमेंट इज परफॉर्मिंग द ड्यूटी. When government has borrowed this money, total borrowing of the government has gone up. सरकार की टोटल बोरोइंग बढ़ गई है ना. हम देखेंगे अगला चैप्टर हमारा गवर्नमेंट बजटिंग का ये, जिसमें हम डेट्स डेफिसिट्स की बात करेंगे. बट यू कैन सी दैट इफ गवर्नमेंट इज बोरोइंग मनी इन फॉर्म ऑफ रीकैप बॉन्ड्स, ये भी तो एक तरीके का गवर्नमेंट बॉन्ड ही है. व्हेन गवर्नमेंट इज बोरोइंग मनी, इट्स टोटल बोरोइंग, इट्स टोटल डेट और लायबिलिटीज हैव गॉन अप. It is being forced to borrow this money because it has to ensure that the bank remains in function. Usually ये जो गवर्नमेंट रीकैप बॉन्ड्स इशू करेगी, usually there is no rule here, there is no rule. Usually when government issues these recap bonds, it will issue them at a zero rate of interest. आपको पैसा चाहिए कैपिटल कितना, हम आपसे पैसा उधार भी लें और आपको उसके बदले इंटरेस्ट भी पे करें. आई एम टेकिंग मनी फ्रॉम यू एंड आई एम गिविंग दिस मनी इन इट्स एंटायर अमाउंट बैक टू यू. I am not using this money for my own expense. I am using this money to recapitalize you. You want me to pay interest over this? Usually, government will not pay an interest on these bonds. Usually, there is no rule that says there is zero coupon on the recap bonds. There is no rule. Sometimes government may pay. Sometimes it may choose not to pay. The decision to pay interest or not pay interest is a decision determined by circumstances. Recap bond मान लो पंजाब एंड सिंध बैंक को इशू किए हैं जहां पे हेल्थ बहुत खराब है, तो सरकार बोलेगी हम तभी आपसे पैसा लेंगे और वापस करेंगे आपको इन फॉर्म ऑफ कैपिटल अगर आप हमको जीरो रेट के ऊपर दोगे. गवर्नमेंट मे से दिस. So as far as economic judgment is concerned, whether it is economically sound or not, I don't think so it's economically unsound. It is a decision of the government that government is borrowing at zero rate and government is giving this money back to the bank. That is my opinion on this. Okay? I think it would have clarified things more to you. So, चलो आगे बढ़ते हैं. This is our discussion on banking. Now we'll start with the new topic of fiscal policy. Fiscal policy and government budgeting. We'll start with the new topic now. Fiscal policy and government budgeting. Chalo, let's start. First, let's see what is it that we are going to discuss in this chapter. देखो आपने, I'm not looking at the chat portal. Chat portal में कोई सवाल प्लीज मत पूछना, वहां पे टाइम ज्यादा लग जाता है आंसर करने के अंदर. If there is any question you would want me to answer, I am looking at the response portal जहाँ पे आप अपना doubts अगर भेजते हो to the coordinator. I am looking at that portal. I am not looking at chat portal. Please don't send your questions there. If anybody has sent their questions there, kindly refrain and send them to the coordinator. They will be answered. If not, I will have a look at them. अगर किसी ने भेजे हैं और कोई क्वेश्चन आंसर नहीं हुआ है तो प्लीज कृपया करके वो वाला चैनल इस्तेमाल करो रादर देन ये चैट वाला चैनल इस्तेमाल करना. ठीक है, अब वो मैं चैट वाला चैनल नहीं देख रहा हूं. I'll answer those questions. अगर बाद में भी अगर let me begin the introduction to this topic. अगर वो बाद में भी आता है तो I'll answer those questions. या क्लास के एंड में I'll answer those questions at the end of the class. Please, any question which you want to ask, please ask on that portal, not on chat. ठीक है, चलो start करते हैं बच्चों. Next topic we'll start. The last topic that I am supposed to take with you is the topic of government budgeting and fiscal policy. You will get these slides today. आज आपको slides मिल जाएंगी ये वाली. Now these slides that I have with me here, these slides were made when course was not trifurcated. I can update these slides, but पूरी ले लेना क्या करोगे. These slides were made when course was not trifurcated into 3 parts. Some part in these slides pertains to some other topics as well. Some parts, 1 or 2 slides pertain to some other topics as well. I think you will be mature enough to see कि भाई ये किसी और topic का इसके अंदर आ गया है. We are talking about fiscal policy and government budgeting. Now this is the broadest topic that there is in that is there in economics. Fiscal policy and government budgeting. क्या पढ़ना है हमें इस टॉपिक में? What is it that we have to study in this topic? What is meant by the word fiscal? Fiscal means treasury. Fiscal means treasury. Money of the government. Money which comes to the government. That is what fiscal. Fiscal policy and government budgeting. What is government budget? Government budget is a Article 112 statement of accounts. Government has to present an annual statement of accounts in the parliament every year, Article 112. And the expenses on that account must clearly distinguish expenses on revenue account and other account. Article 112 में लिखा है expenses must clearly distinguish between expenses on revenue account and other expenses. Annual financial statement. So there is a aspect of polity here. Constitution का part है, there is an aspect of polity here. What is it that we study in this topic of government budget? Economics में हम क्या पढ़ते हैं? Government budget क्या है ये हमको पता है. Now let's realize this budget from a different angle. Not merely with the angle of it being the annual financial statement, but something else. Government budget is simply the manner in which government plans its revenues, plans its expenses. How much does the government expect to collect in a year? How much does the government want to spend in a year? कितना कलेक्शन एक्सपेक्ट कर रहे हो, हाउ मच कलेक्शन डू यू एक्सपेक्ट एंड हाउ मच मनी डू यू प्लान टू स्पेंड इन अ पर्टिकुलर ईयर. When I lay down my plan of expense, when I have an idea of my revenue, then I can see how much amount of shortage is there, how much amount of borrowing has to be done. I can see that there are some schemes in which I can cut down on expense. There are some areas in which expense can become more efficient. All this is what is studied in government budgeting. Government budgeting comprises of this particular topic that we are going to study. This topic comprises of analyzing, assessing government's revenues, government's expenses, government budgeting. इस टॉपिक में हम गवर्नमेंट बजट प्रिपरेशन प्रक्रिया नहीं पढ़ने वाले हैं. We are not going to study the manner in which government budget is prepared. वो पॉलिटी वाला पार्ट है. कौन सा बिल प्रेजेंट हुआ, कब पास हुआ, कैसे पास हुआ, गिलिटोन हुआ, किस डेट को प्रेजेंट हुआ, how much majority is required, passed in Lok Sabha, not in Rajya Sabha. That is quality aspect. That aspect we will not study here. Here we are going to have an analytical discussion on items in the budget. Essentially, what are the items in the budget? There are two items in the budget, revenue side and expense side. We'll try to analyze what comprises of revenue and what comprises of expenses. How are revenue and expenses related to each other? We'll introduce the concept of debts and deficits. There we will study the concept of sustainability of debts and deficits. Recommendations pertaining to how should debts and deficits be managed in an economy. This is what we are going to study in this chapter, the analytical part of assessment of budget. कुछ basic part होगा इसके अंदर. Basic part would be when we study various items, capital क्या है, revenue क्या है, different types of deficits क्या है. That is the basic part that we are going to study, and the advanced part, analysis of those things. Debt का level, उसका analysis. Taxes increase करना, उसका analysis. Expenses reduce करना, that is something which we will not study. That is some part we will study. Expenses को reduction, making them more efficient, some part we will study there as well. So this is broadly what we are going to study in government budgeting. Let's start. The first part that we are going to study in government budgeting is various techniques of preparing government budget. Various ways in which government budget is prepared. Any budget is prepared in different methods, using different methods. First we'll study that. It's going to take us about half an hour to study government budgeting techniques. सबसे पहले हम पढ़ेंगे इस चैप्टर में, फिर से सुनो क्या क्या पढ़ने वाले हमें इस चैप्टर में, सबको समझ में आया? First we will study different techniques of preparing the budget. When I say technique of preparing the budget, I do not mean the process of passing of budget in parliament. That is polity. I'll discuss various techniques using which budget is prepared. That is also public, वो public administration का part है, but हम थोड़ा सा part यहाँ पे पढ़ लेंगे उस चीज को. First we'll discuss preparation of budget. Next we'll go to reading the budget, analyzing the budget. To analyze the budget, we'll first need to understand some basic concepts, terminology used in the budget, और उस terminology को पढ़ने के बाद budget का analysis करेंगे. ये हमारा इस topic का broad path होगा. Let's start. The first thing that we discuss is government budgeting, that is techniques of presenting and analyzing the budget. Techniques of presenting and analyzing the budget. Let's study this. उसके बाद हम ये पढ़ेंगे components of government budget. मैंने बोला basic parts, revenue account, capital account, plan, non-plan, different types of deficits क्या क्या होते हैं, taxes अलग अलग कौन से हैं, direct, indirect, progressive, regressive, different GST वगैरह क्या है. We'll study this. We'll study different expenses, and finally we will move to the analytical part. Analytical part of fiscal policy and government budgeting. This is the important interesting part. We'll study debt management, debt sustainability, and we'll study increasing revenue. Effectively we'll study tax planning and tax evasion. यहाँ पे हम ये चीज पढ़ेंगे. This is the overview of this topic. Let's start with the first topic in this chapter, government budgeting, that is techniques of presenting and analyzing the budget. सबसे पहले हम इस topic को start करते हैं. गवर्नमेंट बजटिंग. आई होप एवरीबडी हैज अंडरस्टूड क्या क्या पढ़ने वाले हैं हम इसमें. The first part is preparing the budget. The second part is analyzing the budget. In analysis of budget, we will study expenses, we will study revenue, and we will study deficits. This is broadly what we are going to study in this chapter. So let's begin the first part of budget preparation. How is budget prepared? Preparation techniques or budgeting techniques. सबसे पहले हम ये स्टार्ट करने वाले हैं. चलो, let's start. Most of you would be, because you are at your home, most of you would be living at your home, that is with your parents. In normal circumstances, if COVID was not there, then probably most of you would be here in the class, as in would have come from different places to Delhi to study. Some of you would be in Delhi already, would be not living with your parents. Some of you would be outside already. When, let's say, you are here in Rajendra Nagar preparing for civil services, your parents send some money to you monthly. Let's say your parents send 50,000 rupees monthly to you. Out of 50,000, you will be spending, let's say, about 20,000 rupees on rent every month. 20,000 रुपए रेंट दोगे हर महीने, और लगभग 20,000 रुपए के आसपास, 20-30,000 रुपए, अगर आप काफी खर्चा करने वाले व्यक्ति हो, स्टूडेंट हो, तो आप 20-30,000 रुपए का खर्चा भी करोगे हर महीने. Expense incurred in food, in your books, in your notes, transportation, चाय सुट्टा मारना, you will incur expenses on lot of different aspects. What you do is you start to prepare a list of expenses, list of items where you have incurred the expense. I'll repeat. You are living here, and now what you have done is you have started to prepare a list of items where you spend money. आप गए खान, your one day expense looks like some item 1 expense, item 2 expense, item 3 expense, or 1 day or 1 month expense looks something like this. How much expense have you incurred on any item? How much expense has been incurred by you on any particular item? You simply start writing all your expenses. You have got entire data with respect to कहां पे एक रुपया खर्च हुआ है. This method of preparing the budget is the most simplest one, which is called as line item budgeting. Line item budgeting. Let me explain what line item budgeting is. Line item budget. When you budget क्या होता है? Budget is futuristic. यहां पे आपने क्या किया था, जो मैंने आपको एग्जांपल दिया, the example that I've given you is you write down your expenses as they occur. आज आपने एक पानी की बोतल खरीदी, आपने लिखा water bottle 10 rupees. You purchased something, you wrote down, you took an e-rickshaw 20 rupees. You had food, you wrote down food 100 rupees. You are writing expenses as they occur. When you write expenses as they occur, that is not budgeting. That is simply keeping a record of expenses. I'll repeat. When you are writing expenses as they occur, वो budgeting नहीं है, वो केवल expenses का record है. Versus, now you know where do you spend money. You have a rough idea where you spend money. Therefore, what you do is, on 1st of every month, you write down, you make a list that this month my expenses are going to look like this. When you do it in advance, then it is budgeting. When you do it on the go, then it is simply record keeping. Difference समझ में आया? Record keeping और budgeting में काम दोनों में same कर रहे हो. You are simply writing how much money are you going to spend on one item. Item 1 expense, item 2 expense, item 3, item 4 expense against every item. When you make this list, after or while incurring the expense. It is simply record keeping of your expense. Versus you do this in advance. You prepare a budget. You know that I have got 40,000 rupees which I have to spend every month. And now you are writing कि item 1 पे इतना, 2 पे इतना, 3 पे इतना. This is how much I am going to spend. Versus this is how much I spent. जब आप ये काम करते हो, then it is called as preparing a budget. A budget prepared like this, that is when you write item wise expense. Item, item, item and expense against all those items. That is simply called as a line item budgeting technique. Simplest one. आपने प्लान किया है, you have planned in future, in advance, you have planned in, not future, you have planned in advance that how are you going to spend the amount of money that you have. Line item budget. सबको समझ में आया क्या है line item budgeting technique? सबसे सिंपल तरीका, 1 तारीख को कॉपी पेन लेके बैठ गए और उस 1 तारीख को आपने लिखा कि इस महीने my expense are going to be item 1 this, 2 this, 3 this, 4 this, 5 this. On 1st of every month, you write down, this is how I'm going to spend this month. You are planning, you are budgeting. Budgeting advance में होती है. Government, when it presents the budget, I hope you know this. When government presents the budget, it presents the budget for the year which is coming, not the year which has gone by. It presents the budget which has estimations of taxes and estimations of expenses for the year which is coming. February 2021, 1st Feb 2021 को जब गवर्नमेंट ने बजट प्रेजेंट किया, it was a budget for the year starting 1st April 2021 ending 31st March 2022. On February 1, you are presenting the budget of next year, that is coming year. You plan in advance. When you plan like this, you simply write down items and what expense you are going to incur on those items. This is called as line item budgeting technique. Rudimentary, the most simplest budgeting method, line item budgeting. Second, अच्छा सुनो, ये गवर्नमेंट बजटिंग टेक्निक्स के मैं नोट्स नहीं लिखवाऊंगा. आई विल नॉट डिक्टेट नोट्स ऑफ दीज गवर्नमेंट बजटिंग टेक्निक्स. लाइन आइटम, परफॉर्मेंस, प्रोग्राम, आउटकम, ये सब मैं इनके नोट्स नहीं लिखवाऊंगा. यू हैव दीज नोट्स, देयर इज जस्ट वेरी थिन बुकलेट अवेलेबल. प्लीज वहां से पढ़ना, प्लीज वहां से पढ़ना. अगर किसी को नोट्स लिखने हैं तो जो मैं बोल रहा हूं प्लीज साथ साथ लिख लेना. देयर इज नो नीड फॉर मी टू डिक्टेट नोट्स टू दिस, प्लीज. ठीक है, आप समझ सकते हो. दिस इज समझ सकते हो का मतलब ये है कि पहली बात तो ये पब्लिक एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन का टॉपिक है. दिस इज नॉट इकोनॉमिक्स टॉपिक, मतलब पब्लिक एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन का इकोनॉमिक्स पार्ट का टॉपिक है. ठीक है, ऐसे बोल लेते हैं. सेकंड, दिस इज समथिंग विच यू हैव very precise notes on in your printed material. Please refer to that. Please refer to that. I will try. What I am trying to do in the class is I am trying to simplify those notes for you. I am trying to simplify what you are going to see in those notes. Please understand what these budgeting techniques are. Then when you read from the material, it would be easy. थोड़ा सा लिखवा दूंगा, बहुत थोड़ा सा लिखवाऊंगा, बट डिटेल में नहीं लिखूंगा. बहुत थोड़ा सा, 2 लाइन लिखवाऊंगा, इससे ज्यादा नहीं लिखवाऊंगा. ठीक है. This is the most rudimentary, the most basic type of budgeting called as line item budget. You are simply writing the item and expense against that item. Now, when you budget in this manner, item and expense, when you budget in this manner, it is simply data. ये data है. It is not an information. You don't get any information from this. It is raw data. You cannot analyze this data. So much data is available that I have spent. Let's say government is preparing budget, or let's say you are preparing budget. You said that I will spend this much money in this particular month on all these items. You start writing. My day starts like this. Then I go to have breakfast. I go to have lunch. I go to have dinner. और हर बार आपने लिखा है that in breakfast, let's say I go to dinner. I go to have dinner. I take an e-rickshaw. I will spend 10 rupees there. I will eat food, I will spend 100 rupees there. Then I will come back, and while coming back, I will have chai and cigarette. I will spend this money on this much on these items. I will come back by an e-rickshaw. I will spend this much money there. I may get my friend in between. Therefore, I am going to spend 100 rupees on friend also. So, आपने item by item ये चीजें लिखी हैं. अब all these things do not convey much information. It is a record. You have kept a record, or you are planning to keep a record in future. But information analysis यहाँ पे कुछ नहीं है. You cannot analyze this data while you are preparing this budget. It is simply raw data. It doesn't give any sort of information. It is a more detailed record. It is a very detailed record of how much do you plan to spend in future. But other than that or more than that, it is no information. कोई information नहीं है इसके अंदर. सबसे ज्यादा डिटेल्ड है, लेकिन इंफॉर्मेशन एनालिसिस इसके अंदर कुछ नहीं कर पाओगे आप, मुश्किल है बहुत ज्यादा. The next type of budget or evolution in budgeting, evolution in preparing budget was, next evolution was from line item you went to something called as evolution of budgeting. Line item से आपने evolve किया to something called as program budget. Program budget. The second type of budgeting technique is program budgeting or program budget, preparing a program budget. What is a program budget? Program budget is, rather than writing all expenses item by item, every line item by item, line item budgeting. Rather than writing all the expenses item by item, you categorize them into programs. हर एक आइटम के अगेंस्ट एक्सपेंस लिखने के बजाय यू कैटेगराइज दोज एक्सपेंसेस एज अ प्रोग्राम. द प्रोग्राम इज हैविंग लंच. अब आपने in this line item budget, simply understand it like this, you have now given a subheading that says, पहले आपका बजट इस टाइप से था, लाइन बाय लाइन आइटम बाय आइटम था. Now what you have done is you have clubbed let's say there are 8 items. What you have done is you have clubbed 1, 3 and 6 together into one subheading. You have clubbed 2, 4 and 5 together in another subheading. There is a program 1, and that program 1 comprises of expense on 1, 3 and 6. There is a program 2 which comprises of expenses 2, 4 and 5. Program 3 that comprises of all other expenses. What you have done is, now you have categorized, you have organized your expenses in a manner that now you see how much are you spending on this particular program. एक program पे कितना spend कर रहे हो. Let's say your program is having food. Food के ऊपर कितना spend कर रहे हो, that needs expense on going e-rickshaw, चाय, cigarette and food. Now you have categorized all those expenses as one. Class जाने में कितना spend कर रहे हो, going to class, you have categorized all these expenses as one. You now categorize expenses rather than writing them individually like this. You now write them as part of programs. It's simply giving a subheading and organizing your expenses properly. This is what is there in a program budget. Please wait, I will give examples of government budgeting also. मैं आपको पहले बस बजटिंग की टेक्निक्स बता दूं, उसके बाद आई विल गिव एग्जांपल्स विद एक्चुअल बजटिंग इन द गवर्नमेंट. दिस इज व्हाट प्रोग्राम बजट इज. What we are doing in program budget, you are essentially organizing expenses by programs. Now you have got more information. Now you know how much money you spend in having food, or how much money you spend in having some other in some other program, in some other task that you have to do. You have now organized your expenses. This is called program budgeting. The next set of evolution in budgeting technique is performance budgeting. Performance budgeting. अगली budgeting technique है performance budgeting. The next evolution from program to performance. नाम से समझ में आ रहा है परफॉर्मेंस में क्या होगा. परफॉर्मेंस बजट फोकसेस अपॉन एफिशिएंसी ऑफ एक्सपेंसेस. In program budget, what you are doing is you are simply organizing your expenses so that you can have a look. Okay, this program requires this much, this program requires this much. You organize your expenses by programs. In performance budget, what you do is you take into account efficiency of your expense. जैसे efficiency of your expense. In program budget, you wrote down that I go to my expense on having food was one program and expense on groceries is another program. खाने खाने पे, खाना खाना is one program and going and groceries shopping is another program. In your expense of food, you wrote down that my expense of food comprises of transportation cost going back and forth to my mess, food plus some other miscellaneous expenses. In your groceries, you wrote down groceries cost includes going to the grocery shop, transportation cost plus groceries. You now know that what you can do is that when you go and have food, you can minimize your transportation cost, क्योंकि जब food खाने जा रहे हो वहीं पे आप पास में groceries खरीद सकते हो. You can reduce your transportation cost if you try to ensure that you buy groceries while you are going to have food. You are trying to introduce efficiency in your expenses. When you try to introduce efficiency in your expenses, then you call it a performance budget. Performance budgeting. You are trying to increase efficiency of your expenses. I just give just one example. Efficiency can be improved in thousands of different ways. One way of improving efficiency is that you reduce your transportation cost. Rather than incurring transportation cost multiple times, you incur it only once. One way of improving efficiency. और भी कई सारे तरीके हो सकते हैं. Rather than going and buying groceries, one way of improving efficiency is that you buy from, let's say, Amazon or Big Basket. Maybe it's cheaper to buy from there. Maybe. Any which way, any technique, any method that you introduce in your budget which leads to increasing efficiency of your expense. You are doing less, you are spending less and getting more. That is called as performance budgeting. Performance budgeting is simply when you introduce the element of efficiency in your expenses. First, line item budget, simply a line by line or an item by item record of how much money are you going to spend. Second, program budget. You organize your expenses by programs to see how much money is being spent on a particular program. Third, performance budgeting. You introduce the element of efficiency in your budgeting, as in you reduce the expenses wherever they can be reduced. Efficiency based budgeting is performance budgeting. The next budgeting technique is outcome budgeting. Performance के बाद outcome budgeting. Outcome budget. What is outcome versus what is output? Line item. Next, program. Third, performance. Fourth, outcome. Outcome क्या है? Outcome budgeting is target based budgeting. Target or goal oriented budgeting. Goal oriented budgeting. That is what outcome budgeting is. Target or goal oriented budgeting. Let's continue with the example of going to mess and having food. You are staying in Rajendra Nagar. Let's continue with that example. In line item budget, you are planning how much money are you going to spend on different items. In program budget, you organize your expenses by programs. Let's say food is one program. In performance budget, you introduce the element of efficiency. That is, you reduce, let's say, your transportation cost. Performance budget ban gaya. Outcome. Target or goal oriented budgeting. खाना क्यों खाना है? Why do I have to go out and eat? I have to go out and eat because I want to remain healthy. I have to go out and eat because I want to ensure that I have adequate energy to attend classes and prepare for my exam. I need to remain healthy. I don't want to fall sick. Objective is that I should clear this exam. To clear this exam, I need to remain healthy. To remain healthy, I need to consume good quality food. And for consumption of food, I am going to a restaurant. अभी तक हम क्या कर रहे थे? Expenses को लिख रहे थे कि मैंने खाना खाने जाना है. I have to go out and have food. Then, how to introduce efficiency when I go out and have food? ई-रिक्शा से जाऊं या कैब से जाऊं? Efficiency. Now, outcome. Outcome is target oriented. Where am I eating food? Is the food that I am eating leading me to achieve my target or is it compromising my target? हो सकता है मैं पैसा बचा रहा हूं, maybe I am able to save money by going to some place to eat, but that place doesn't serve hygienic food and therefore chances of me falling ill are high. I may save money, I may become more performance oriented as in efficient, but I will not be able to achieve my target. Target is I consume food because I have to remain healthy. Now I will write down while preparing my budget. Objective is to consume good quality food so that I remain healthy. Objective is to consume good quality food so that I remain healthy, and for that I need to consume food from a restaurant which is serving hygienic food. Maybe a little bit costly but hygienic. In that I will try to ensure that I am efficient. But now my expenses are being categorized, my expenses are being viewed from the angle of whether they are helping me to achieve my target or not. Outcome. खाना खाना तो आउटपुट है, पेट भरना आउटपुट है, लेकिन हेल्दी होना आउटकम है. टू कंस्ट्रक्ट अ स्कूल versus to ensure whether children pass from that school are educated properly or not. What is your target? Is your target that there should be more schools, or is your target that education should be provided for everybody and good quality education? टारगेट क्या है? स्कूल ज्यादा बनाना टारगेट है या फिर लोगों को एजुकेट करना और उनकी समझ में चीजें आना टारगेट है? आई होप द टारगेट इज सेकंड. व्हेन योर टारगेट इज clearly defined, then you try to do expenses which lead to meeting your target. Outcome budgeting. This is how budgeting has evolved in general. Line item budget is the simplest manner of preparing a budget, where you write down expenses line by line or item by item. Then you organize those expenses under the various programs that incur those expenses, program budgeting. Next, you introduce the idea of efficiency, which is called as preparing a performance budget or performance budgeting. And finally, when you prepare budget by taking into account the targets that you want to achieve, that is called as outcome budgeting or outcome based budgeting, target oriented or goal oriented budgeting. Different budgeting techniques that we have. You might have come across the term gender budgeting and zero based budgeting. Gender budget you must have come across. नहीं भी आएगा तो मैं बताऊंगा आपको. Zero based budget, zero based budget, zero based budgeting, ZBB इसको बोलते हैं. ZBB, ZBB, ZBB क्या है? Zero based budgeting. Zero based budgeting is, देखो अभी हमने क्या पढ़ा? Line item, program, performance and outcome. I'll dictate two lines of each. Please wait. I'll dictate two lines for each. 2-3 lines of each. Please wait. Please understand this zero-based budgeting first. These are various budgeting techniques. Manner in which budgeting has evolved over a period of time. Earlier, you used to present a line item budget. Now you are expected to present an outcome budget, a goal-oriented budget. What is zero-based budgeting? Zero-based budgeting is application of these budgeting techniques. I'll repeat, zero-based budgeting is application of this budgeting technique. Outcome budgeting का. ZBB or zero-based budgeting is applying outcome budgeting in reality, in practice. क्या है ZBB? Zero-based budgeting क्या है? Zero-based budgeting is when government prepares budget every year, then how is budget prepared? Different ministries present their demands to Ministry of Finance. Ministry of Water Resources will go to Ministry of Finance and say that there is a program that we are running which goes under the name of Jal Shakti Abhiyan. और जल शक्ति अभियान पे पिछले साल 10,000 करोड़ रुपए आपने दिए थे. You gave 10,000 crore rupees last year for Jal Shakti Abhiyan. Please allocate 10,000 crore rupees this year also for Jal Shakti Abhiyan. Responsibility of preparing budget is of whom? Finance Ministry. Responsibility of implement project with respect to water is of whom? Ministry of Water Resources. Ministry of Water Resources had a program called Jal Shakti Abhiyan, and for that last year government allocated 10,000 crore rupees. This year when budget is being prepared, Ministry of Water goes again to Ministry of Finance and says कि लास्ट ईयर जल शक्ति अभियान के लिए आपने इतना पैसा दिया था, इस साल इतना पैसा दे दो. Whatever money I demand, 10,000, 20,000, whatever amount of money I will demand, please give me this much money for Jal Shakti Abhiyan program. Ministry of Finance, what it will do is, it will say, just because money was allocated last year to this program doesn't mean that it will be allocated again. In order to get this money allocated for this particular scheme, you have to justify whether this scheme has been able to achieve its objectives or not, or is on path of achieving its objectives. आपको जल शक्ति अभियान के लिए पैसा चाहिए. क्यों चलाया था आपने जल शक्ति अभियान? क्या टारगेट था? ये टारगेट था जल शक्ति अभियान का. Has Jal Shakti Abhiyan led to either meeting of this target or is on the path of meeting of this target? That means I am essentially asking for evaluation of this scheme of last year. I will allocate, Ministry of Finance will allocate money to this program only when a justification can be given for a particular scheme. This method of providing allocations is called zero-based budgeting, ZBB. In zero-based budgeting, any expense to be incurred, any expense that the government does is justified, is analyzed again every year. Fresh analysis from base, zero base. Analysis from zero base is undertaken every year with respect to any expense that requires expenses this year as well. If any scheme, any program requires expenses this year, it must be reanalyzed. A justification must be given this year again. So हर साल आप स्कीम को एनालाइज करोगे कि क्या ये आउटकम ओरिएंटेड, टारगेट ओरिएंटेड स्कीम थी और क्या ये अपने टारगेट्स को अचीव कर रही है. If yes, you will allocate money. If no, you will not allocate money. Or maybe reduce, maybe change the scheme. Scheme change करके लाओ तभी पैसा allocate करेंगे. This is what is called as zero-based budgeting. Manner of, a technique of application of outcome budgeting. ZBB, zero-based budgeting. Next, gender budgeting. Gender budget, GB. What is gender budgeting? Gender budgeting is not allocating money specially for women. वो gender budget नहीं है. या फिर अगर और टेक्निकली करेक्ट बोले, that is just one small part of gender budget. Allocating money especially for women, that is not what gender budgeting means. That is just one small part of what is called as gender budgeting. What is gender budgeting? Gender budgeting is when you analyze the differential impact that any expense is going to have on different genders. Differential analysis based on gender of any expense is called gender budgeting. For example, government allocates money for creation of Mahila Thana. अब महिला थाना क्या है? वो एक जेंडर स्पेसिफिक स्कीम है. Because of government allocation of money for creation of Mahila Thana, there is probably going to be some impact on gender. That is, let's say on women, there is going to be some positive impact on women because of creation of Mahila Thanas. Government allocates money for modernization of police force. When police force becomes modernized, let's say there is more digitization, there is more sensitization of police force, the premises becomes more friendly, people become more recipient to your requests. This will it not lead to having a greater impact on crime situation with respect to women or law and order with respect to women? Many women do not go to police people, many women do not come out with their complaints to police because they know that they are not going to be heard. Even men, even normal, any citizen would not like to approach police because they know that they are not going to be heard. But this is more so in case of women. Especially when we know that women are subjects of greater amount of crime. domestic violence plus as well as violence on the streets. More crimes happen on women as compared to that of men. And therefore, if there is modernization of police force, sensitization of police force, more digitization, will it not have a differential impact on law and order situation with respect to women? क्या मैंने जेंडर को सोच के पैसा एलोकेट किया मॉडर्नाइजेशन ऑफ पुलिस फोर्स पे? नहीं, लेकिन मैं एनालाइज कर रहा हूं. आई एम डूइंग एन एनालिसिस दैट व्हाट इफेक्ट विल दिस स्टेप have on particular gender. When I do this analysis, this is called gender budgeting. Obviously now you understand, if I allocate money specifically for women, some women specific scheme is there that is going to have an impact on women specifically. वो एनालिसिस जेंडर बजटिंग है, वो स्कीम जेंडर बजटिंग नहीं है. वो स्कीम बस उसका एक छोटा सा पार्ट है. जेंडर बजटिंग एंड जीरो बेस्ड बजटिंग. I hope this is clear to everybody what different types of budgeting techniques are. Let's take a break of about 5-6 minutes. Break के बाद I'll dictate, लगभग 10 मिनट के लिए डिक्टेट करूं, 10-12 मिनट, इससे ज्यादा डिक्टेट नहीं करूंगा with respect to this. Not more than 10-12 minutes, 2-3 lines at max. While dictating, I will dictate with the help of government example. अभी भी समझ में आ गया आपको, गवर्नमेंट बजट को भी आपको काफी समझ में आ गया होगा. Let's take a break. It's 7 o'clock. It's going to be 7:05 में मिलते हैं. Let's meet at 7:05. ठीक है? Any question if anybody has? ब्रेक के बाद, डिक्टेशन के बाद के लिए रिजर्व करो. Questions with respect to government budgeting अभी मत पूछना. Please don't ask question with respect to government budgeting. अभी ask your questions once I am done with the dictation. उसके बाद पूछना, तब तक एब्जॉर्ब करो और समझ में आएगा डिक्टेशन के बाद. विद रिस्पेक्ट टू गवर्नमेंट बजटिंग बाद में सवाल पूछना जब मैं डिक्टेट कर लूंगा. उससे पहले बैंक वाला या फिर कुछ और पूछना है तो आप पूछ सकते हो. आई विल आंसर, और एनी अदर क्वेश्चन दैट यू वांट मी टू आंसर पूछ लेना. ठीक है, तो ब्रेक ले लेते हैं. 7:05 में मिलते हैं. करे चलो चलो लेट्स let's please write down, give heading government budgeting, give heading government budgeting. Please write first techniques of government budget. First, the big heading, the name of the chapter is government budgeting. Next, the subheading that we are going to write is techniques of government budget preparation. Techniques of government budget preparation. Techniques of government budget preparation. देखो preparing government budget, preparing government budget, preparing government budget is a task, preparing government budget is a task of Ministry of Finance, is a task of Ministry of Finance, which is a task of Ministry of Finance, which prepares estimates, of the amount of revenue, which prepares estimates of the amount of revenue that it expects to collect, of the amount of revenue that it expects to collect, and the amount of expenses on various items, and the amount of expenses on various items that it expects to incur, that it expects to incur. Good stop. Planning for expenses in advance. Planning for expenses in advance. planning for expenses in advance helps the government to undertake only those expenses which are high on priority and reduce wasteful expenses Full stop. This requires an analytical view of the budget making exercise. This requires an analytical view of the budget making exercise. Full stop. Budget making has broadly evolved in the following stages. Through the following stages. Budget making has broadly evolved through the following stages. फ्लो चार्ट की तरह लिखना, फ्लो चार्ट की तरह 1 2 3 4 इस टाइप से. You have to write 4 numbers, you have to write 4 words, line item, program, performance and outcome. Make sure you write 4 of these in one line. एक लाइन में लिखो. सबसे पहले लाइन आइटम, नेक्स्ट एरो लगा के प्रोग्राम बजटिंग, एरो लगा के परफॉर्मेंस बजटिंग, एरो लगा के आउटकम बजटिंग. राइट लाइक दिस. इन वन लाइन यू हैव टू राइट दिस. लाइन आइटम बजट, एरो प्रोग्राम बजट, एरो परफॉर्मेंस बजट, एरो आउटकम बजट. Preparation of budgeting has evolved like the following, in the following stages. Line item, program, performance and outcome. लिखो उसके नीचे, start writing. A line item budget is simply an item by item record of expenses. Full stop. It is the most detailed budget. It is the most detailed budgeting technique. It is the most detailed budgeting technique where every expense is mentioned. Full stop. However, there is not much analysis. Which can be achieved. There is not much analysis which can be achieved from it. Full stop. Next line में लिखना. In a program budget, expenses are organized by programs. Full stop. For example, expenses of Ministry of Health. Under the immunization program. Or under the vaccination program, or under the nutritional programs are mentioned separately. Full stop. This helps to visualize expenses. At a broader level. Full stop. Next line में लिखो. A performance budget is an efficiency oriented budget. A performance budget is an efficiency oriented budget. Full stop. In performance budgeting, or in it लिख लो. In it, efficiency becomes the focus of expenses. That is, maximum is sought to be achieved. With minimum expenses. Full stop. For example, the same facility may be used for both the immunization and vaccination program of the government. Here I'm really sorry. I'm using the word immunization and vaccination separately. By immunization program, I mean immunization of children. By vaccination, I mean vaccination for COVID. So write like this. If you have not written, then please write like this. If you have written, then modify your statement like this. For example, the same facility can be used for immunization of children, and vaccination of adults for COVID. Same facility can be used for immunization of children and vaccination of adults for COVID, comma, thereby reducing the logistics expenses. Full stop. Next, an outcome budget is a target or goal oriented budget. An outcome budget is a target or goal oriented budget. Full stop. Outcome is different from output. Full stop. For example, output is number of health facilities created by the government. Output is number of health facilities created by the government, comma, whereas outcome is improvement in health indicators of the population. Whereas outcome is improvement in health indicators of the population. Full stop. In outcome budgeting, expenses are done when they achieve the desired target. When they achieve the desired target. Full stop. Next subheading though, zero based budgeting, ZBB. Give next subheading, zero based budgeting, ZBB. Write down. Zero based budgeting is a budgeting technique, in which expenses are approved, for a particular program or scheme, for a particular program or scheme only after their justification. Only after their justification. Full stop. Every expense is analyzed from its base every year. Every expense is analyzed from its base every year, and only if it is deemed fit, for continuation, comma, is the expense allocated in the present year. Is the expense allocated in the present year. Full stop. Next लिखो gender budgeting. Right? Gender budgeting. Write down. Gender budgeting is not simply allocation of money, to different genders. Full stop. Gender based allocation is just one part of gender budgeting. Gender based allocation is just one part of gender budgeting. Full stop. Gender budgeting is GB लिख लो. Gender budgeting is analyzing the expenses in the budget. Gender budgeting is analyzing the expenses in the budget based on differential impact, that they are going to have, on different genders. Full stop. For example, if increased allocation is done for modernization of police force, then the impact on women, that such an allocation will have, is analyzed and such an analysis is what gender budgeting is, and such an analysis is what gender budgeting is. ठीक है? Clear? This is sufficient for budgeting techniques. जो हमने लिखा है ना, this is more than sufficient. In fact, जितना हमने लिख लिया है, beyond this, you don't need to go to that document. Honestly speaking, वो जो डॉक्यूमेंट है वो मैंने आज से 3-4 साल पहले एक बार पढ़ा था, जो गवर्नमेंट बजटिंग वाला डॉक्यूमेंट है ना, जो हमारा मटेरियल में है. इट हैज बीन रिवाइज्ड आफ्टर दैट. वो रिवीजन के बाद मैंने नहीं पढ़ा है. 3-4 साल पहले पढ़ा था. हमारा जो विजन का डॉक्यूमेंट है गवर्नमेंट बजटिंग को लेके, जिसमें ये डिफरेंट टाइप्स ऑफ बजटिंग टेक्निक्स एक्सप्लेन कर रखी हैं. टू बी वेरी ऑनेस्ट, वो बहुत ही गंदा लिखा हुआ था. I could not understand anything that was written there, कि क्या है लाइन आइटम, क्या है परफॉर्मेंस, क्या है प्रोग्राम. Why could I not understand? I will tell you this also, so that you don't make that mistake of not understanding. मैं ये नहीं बोल रहा हूं कि वो मटेरियल गंदा है, मैं बोल रहा हूं कि मैं नहीं समझ पाया था उस मटेरियल को. It might be good, but I was not able to understand. Why? Because when we are students, then our objective is we try to understand things from the point of remembering and knowing differences. लाइन आइटम ये वर्सेस परफॉर्मेंस ये वर्सेस प्रोग्राम ये वर्सेस आउटकम ये. We try to look at these things with the objective of knowing some certain points which we can use to distinguish these things. अगर हम इस माइंडसेट से उस चीज को पढ़ेंगे तो we will get confused. What we have written with respect to government budgeting techniques is, in my opinion, more than sufficient for us as GS students. For public administration students, you need more understanding. आपको ज्यादा पता होना चाहिए, आपको ज्यादा पता करना पड़ेगा. पब्लिक एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन के पेपर 2 के अंदर जो फाइनेंशियल पार्ट है उसके अंदर ये चीज आपको वहां से पढ़नी पड़ेगी. For GS, those whose optional is not PubAd, those whose optional is not economics, what we have done, what we have studied in the class is more than sufficient. This is the first aspect of government budgeting that we have studied, that is various techniques of preparing government budget. ठीक है? I hope this is clear to everybody. अब अगर किसी को कोई सवाल पूछना है तो पूछो गवर्नमेंट बजटिंग के अंदर. आई होप जिन्होंने पूछा था जेंडर बजट एक्सप्लेन कर दो दोबारा से या फिर कुछ, आई थिंक अब सब क्लियर हो गया होगा जब हमने लिख लिया. तो वंस वी हैव रिटन इट देन थिंग्स बिकम मोर क्लियर. आगे बढ़ते हैं. इफ एनीबडी वांट टू आस्क अ क्वेश्चन प्लीज आस्क. बैंकिंग वाले अगर किसी का सवाल है तो वो मैं क्लास के लास्ट में ले लूंगा. अगर इस पर्टिकुलर टॉपिक से कोई सवाल है तो अभी आप पूछ लो. मीनवाइल आई एम स्टार्टिंग. Government budgeting. So first part with respect to preparation of government budget, as in first part with respect to technique of preparation of government budget is we have seen. Now we'll move on to the analytical part of government budget. In the analytical part of government budget, we have to understand various terms that are there in government budget. Then after understanding those terms, we will be able to do analysis of government budget. क्योंकि हमने अभी तक बिल्कुल नहीं पढ़ा है तो हमको पहले बेसिक पढ़ना पड़ेगा कुछ टर्म्स का, उसके बाद हमको एनालिसिस करने की क्षमता मिलेगी. गवर्नमेंट बजटिंग, टू अंडरस्टैंड वेरियस बेसिक टर्म्स with respect to government budget, that is our first part, and then from there we will do the analysis part of government budget. So let's start. In your polity classes you must have studied about what government budget is. How is the government budget prepared? You should know that we have got article 112 under which the government is responsible to present an annual statement of accounts, annual financial statement to the parliament, in which the expenses of the government must be clearly distinguished between revenue expense and other expenses. ये हमने पॉलिटी में पढ़ा है. The process of passing all these things we have done. Now let's look at the government budget. What is essentially a government budget? A government budget is essentially government collects taxes from people and government spends that money. If you remember in our prehistoric days, हमने एक चीज पढ़ी थी फर्स्ट फ्यू क्लासेस, जिन क्लासेस के अंदर देयर वाज अ लिटिल बिट डिस्कंफर्ट बिटवीन सम स्टूडेंट्स एंड द मैनर इन विच क्लासेस वर टेकन अप। फर्स्ट फ्यू क्लासेस जो हमारी थी, याद है? आपको याद नहीं होगा, फर्स्ट फ्यू क्लासेस में हमने कुछ चीजें पढ़ी थी, बेसिक कॉन्सेप्ट्स ऑफ इकोनॉमिक्स। वी डिस्कस्ड, इफ यू रिमेंबर, प्रोडक्शन पॉसिबिलिटी कर्व, एक कर्व हमने बनाया था। उसके बाद हमने पढ़ा था मार्जिनल कॉस्ट, अपॉर्चुनिटी कॉस्ट। उसके बाद हमने पढ़ा था लॉ ऑफ डिमांड, लॉ ऑफ सप्लाई, मार्केट्स, गिविंग ऑल ऑफ द थिंग्स एज कांस्टेंट, प्राइस ऑफ द गुड इंक्रीजेस, डिमांड डिक्रीजेस, given all other things as constant, when price of the good increases its supply increases or production increases, law of demand, law of supply, हमने initial first few classes में पढ़ा था। We studied evolution of economic thought, classical school, Keynesian school, monetary school. It's okay if you don't remember, I understand, I know। उस बात को लगभग मेरे ख्याल से अप्रैल में हमारी क्लासेस स्टार्ट हुई थी, अप्रैल में हमने वो चीज पढ़ी थी, अप्रैल में, एज इन माय क्लासेस इन योर बैच स्टार्टेड इन द मंथ ऑफ अप्रैल, सो अप्रैल में पढ़ा था, तो इट्स लॉन्ग टाइम। आई नो यू वुड नॉट हैव रिवाइज्ड, इट वुड बी अनफेयर ऑन मी इफ आई एक्सपेक्ट यू टू रिमेंबर दोस थिंग्स, बट टू जस्ट ब्रीफली रिकैप, हमने पढ़ा था अलग अलग टाइप ऑफ गुड्स पढ़े थे, नॉर्मल गुड्स, इंफीरियर गुड्स, कैपिटल गुड्स, कंज्यूमर गुड्स, लग्जरी गुड्स, नेसेसरी गुड्स, कॉम्प्लीमेंट्री, सब्सटीट्यूट, डिफरेंट टाइप्स ऑफ गुड्स। जस्ट गो बैक, आज पढ़ने की जरूरत नहीं है, अभी भी हम उसको रेफर नहीं करेंगे, जस्ट गो बैक एंड रीड इफ यू गेट टाइम टू रिवाइज। उसमें हमने एक और डिस्टिंक्शन पढ़ा था लास्ट में, एट द एंड ऑफ अवर डिस्टिंक्शन ऑफ डिफरेंट टाइप्स ऑफ गुड्स, वन टाइप ऑफ डिस्टिंक्शन वी स्टडीड वाज ऑफ पब्लिक गुड्स एंड प्राइवेट गुड्स। I'll recap what public goods and private goods are, because I do not expect that you remember what public goods and private goods are. Investment models is a topic that would have been done in your class. I think Sunil sir is taking that part, investment models wala part. वहां पे I think he would have taught you about, he would have talked about public goods and private goods, public private partnership बताया होगा ना investment models में। अगर वो नहीं हुई है तो शायद बताएंगे, अगर हो गई है तो आपको पता होगा। In any case, I'll quickly recap what we did then. One distinction between goods that we studied, that was our third class, तीसरी क्लास हमने पढ़ा था, one distinction of goods that we studied was distinction between public goods and private goods. What are public goods, what are private goods? I'll briefly recap, and from that you will be able to link that with government budget now. Public goods क्या होते हैं और private goods क्या होते हैं? Goods which are goods which can be presented by the market, goods which the market can produce, goods in which there is a demand, that is willingness to buy, and there is a supply, that is willingness to produce. Goods in which there is a demand and supply, that is they can be provided for by the market. If there is a demand, there will be a supply. The goods can be produced by the market. Market उस goods को produce कर सकती है. Such goods were called private goods. Doesn't matter whether government produces them or private sector produces them. Government भी produce कर सकती है. As a producer, government can enter the market and produce. Doesn't matter whether government is producing or private sector is producing. If the good can be provided for by the market, it is called as a private good. Banking service, सरकारी बैंक्स है, लेकिन क्या बैंकिंग सर्विस एक पब्लिक गुड है? नहीं, बैंकिंग सर्विस एक प्राइवेट गुड है। एज इन द गुड और दिस सर्विस इज प्रोवाइडेड फॉर बाय द मार्केट, देयर इज अ डिमांड, देयर इज अ सर्विस। कोल सरकार प्रोड्यूस करती है, ओनली कोल इंडिया लिमिटेड प्रोड्यूसेस कोल, देयर इज अ मोनोपोली ऑफ कोल इंडिया लिमिटेड इन प्रोडक्शन ऑफ कोल। ओनली गवर्नमेंट कंपनी प्रोवाइड्स दिस गुड। डज इट मीन दैट कैन ओनली गवर्नमेंट प्रोवाइड? वो तो रेस्ट्रिक्शन लगा रखी है प्राइवेट सेक्टर पे, इसीलिए प्राइवेट सेक्टर नहीं प्रोवाइड कर पा रहा है। अब वो रेस्ट्रिक्शन भी रिमूव कर दी गई है। बट अदरवाइज कैनॉट प्राइवेट सेक्टर प्रोड्यूस कोल फ्रॉम द ग्राउंड? इट कैन इफ देयर इज अ डिमांड फॉर कोल, प्राइवेट सेक्टर कैन माइन एंड प्रोवाइड कोल। Government is providing coal via Coal India Limited doesn't mean that coal is a public good. Private sector can very well provide for that good if it is given permission for that by the government. It is a private good. Why? Because market can provide. Just because government is providing doesn't make it a public good. Government can provide a private good as well. versus public good. Again, as I said, I don't expect that you remember, इसीलिए मैं आपको recap करवा रहा हूं, कोई problem नहीं है. I know बहुत time हो चुका है, आपको याद नहीं होगा. Versus public good. What is a public good? A public good is a good which is produced in situation of market failure. Specific reason of market failure leads to production of public good. Page मत पलटो please, इधर सुनो. Do not turn your pages and see what was public good. क्या लिखा था पढ़ने को, जो मैं बोल रहा हूं सुनो, मैं आपको सारा एक्सप्लेन कर रहा हूं क्या है. Public good is a special good which is produced, is a good which is produced in some circumstances of market failure. The good is failed to be, the market fails to provide for a particular good. Since the market fails to provide for a particular good, the government has to essentially provide that good. Since the market has failed, that is why government is providing. Government is not providing because government has restricted others. Government is providing that good because market is failing to provide that good. What are these goods? Public goods. Why does the market fail? We discussed there is a free rider problem. ये भी डिस्कस किया था हमने. कोई बात नहीं, याद नहीं है तो इधर सुनो, लिखो. ये सब हम लिख चुके हैं, अभी रिवाइज करो. Free rider problem. What is a free rider problem? Free rider problem is I will pay for a good, but others will ride along with me to enjoy that good. Nobody else has paid for it, only I have paid for it. But everyone else is enjoying the benefits of that good. I cannot exclude others from enjoying the benefits of a good for which I have paid. मैंने पे किया है किसी चीज के लिए, लेकिन मेरे पे करने पर सब लोग उसका इस्तेमाल कर रहे हैं. केवल मैं नहीं, सब लोग उसका इस्तेमाल कर रहे हैं. Why will I pay? I will expect somebody else to pay. Somebody else will expect somebody else to pay. Nobody is willing to pay for such a good. Why? Because you cannot exclude others from enjoying the benefits of that good. Take for example, clean air. Clean air, something which is demanded for by everybody. Everybody needs clean air. You are in Delhi NCR, you need clean air. Do I want clean air? Yes, I want clean air. Am I willing to provide, am I willing to get clean air? Yes, I am willing to pay to get clean air. I am even willing to pay to get clean air. Will I pay for clean air? No, I will not pay for clean air. क्या मैं पे करना चाहता हूं? हां, लेकिन क्या मैं पे करूंगा? नहीं. Why? Because if I pay for clean air, everybody will enjoy clean air. Let's not take into account philanthropic gestures. Philanthropy की बात नहीं कर रहे हैं, मार्केट इकोनॉमिक्स की बात कर रहे हैं. We are not talking about any philanthropic gesture कि मैंने दिया, मैंने डोनेट कर दिया कि भाई ठीक है एक स्मोक टावर लगवा दो. I'm not talking about that. If I pay for a smog tower, everybody will enjoy clean air because of that smog tower. I cannot exclude others from enjoying clean air. Hence, I will not pay. Nobody will pay for clean air if you cannot exclude others. अगर मैं पे कर रहा हूं तो मैं चाहूंगा कि मैं कंज्यूम करूं या फिर वही लोग कंज्यूम करें जिनको मैं चाहता हूं कि वो कंज्यूम कर पाए. Rather than providing for clean air, rather than paying for clean air, what I will do is I will buy an air purifier for my home. Air purifier क्या है? वो मेरे घर की हवा साफ कर रहा है. तो अब मैंने रिस्ट्रिक्ट कर दिया, केवल वो लोग साफ हवा एंजॉय करेंगे जो मेरे घर में है, बाकी कोई और नहीं. I am restricting other, I am excluding others from enjoying this clean air. Does everybody demand clean air? Yes. Are people even willing to pay? Maybe yes. But will they actually pay? No. Why won't they pay? Because they know when they pay, everybody else enjoys. Therefore, nobody is willing to pay. Since nobody is willing to pay, therefore, nobody will be willing to provide or produce. कोई देना ही नहीं चाहता है तो फिर कोई कैसे प्रोड्यूस करेगा? If nobody is willing to pay for clean air, why would any producer produce clean air or make arrangements for cleaning up of air? Why would any producer do that? Hence, there exists some good or service for which there is a demand but there is no supply. डिमांड है बट कोई सप्लाई नहीं है. सप्लाई क्यों नहीं है? क्योंकि nobody is willing to pay. There exists a demand, yes. Is there a supply? No. Hence market failure. Demand है लेकिन supply है ही नहीं. Market fails to provide that good. Such goods will be provided for by the government. They become public goods. Take law and order. Take security of the nation's boundaries. You pay for security. I'm sorry. Do you pay for law and order of your city or of your vicinity? No, you don't. If you pay for security, you would want, सबसे पहले मैं सिक्योर हूं, मेरे खिलाफ कोई क्राइम नहीं होना चाहिए. I want to be secured. बट क्या पुलिस केवल आपको सिक्योर करती है? नहीं. पुलिस सिक्योर्स एवरीबडी इक्वली, और एटलीस्ट थ्योरेटिकली पुलिस सिक्योर्स एवरीबडी इक्वली. If there is an army man at the border protecting the border, is he securing border only for one person? No. He is securing borders for every citizen of the country. Security provided by army at the borders is enjoyed by everybody in the country, not one or a specific group of people. Everybody enjoys that good or service. Clean air, water, law and order, enjoyed by everybody equally, not one person. These goods are essential goods which are provided for by the government because the market fails to provide these goods. अगर मैं सिक्योरिटी के लिए प्रोवाइड करूंगा तो मैं अपनी सिक्योरिटी चाहूंगा. आई विल हायर प्राइवेट बॉडीगार्ड, आई विल हायर प्राइवेट सिक्योरिटी फॉर माई ओन प्रोटेक्शन. दैट इज रिस्पॉन्सिबल टू प्रोटेक्ट मी, नॉट अदर्स. वर्सेस पुलिस प्रोटेक्ट्स एवरीबडी, नॉट अ स्पेसिफिक पर्सन. Public goods, there is a demand of law and order, there is a demand of security, but nobody is willing to pay for that. Why? Because if I pay, I would want a personal security rather than a general security. Hence a free rider problem, market failure. Therefore government is expected to then provide these basic goods. इनको हम बोलते हैं public goods. Public goods are provided for by the government, and in return government takes a general payment for these public goods. Public goods are provided for by the government, and in return government takes a general payment in form of taxes. पढ़ा है पॉलिटी में आपने? टैक्स क्या है? टैक्स is a general payment that you do to the government. For what? For provision of public goods. अब समझ में आ रहा है? अप्रिशिएट करोगे इस चीज को कि सेस क्या होता है? व्हाट इज अ सेस? व्हाट इज अ फी? सेस इज a specific type of tax imposed on a specific, for a specific purpose. Education cess, Swachh Bharat cess. That means money is being collected for you for a specific purpose of cleaning the country, of providing free education to people in the country. Money is being collected for a very specific purpose. Versus you pay a tax. Tax is not paid specifically for provision of security at the border. Tax is not paid specifically for provision of security in your vicinity through police force. Tax is not paid for construction of roads specifically. Tax is not paid for payment of salaries to staff of the government. Tax is a general payment that you do to the government. And when you do this general payment to the government, you expect that government will provide some public goods back to you. You pay in general, you pay in lump sum. आपने सरकार को lump sum amount दे दिया कि ये लो मेरी तरफ से पूरा टैक्स, अब मेरे को रिटर्न में पब्लिक गुड्स चाहिए. What public goods will be provided? Certain public goods in which government thinks are essential to be provided, in which market is incapable to provide them. Public goods will be provided by the government to the citizens in general, in return for this general payment that citizens do to the government, that is taxes. Tax collection in return for public goods. This is the concept of public goods. The idea behind government budget is that government collects a lump sum payment in form of taxes, and from those taxes government decides which public good to provide. Public goods, if we look at them, the demand can be endless. किसी की demand है that public good is I should get, there must be good irrigation infrastructure in my district. For somebody else, public good is government should provide free seeds for cultivation. For somebody else, public good is government should provide free electricity and water to farmer. कोई बोलेगा public good is government should procure my produce at a price much higher than what market is giving me. For somebody else, public good is government is responsible to provide fertilizer to me at a subsidized rate. Demand of public goods is infinite. Ability of government to pay for public goods or provide public goods is limited. In a government budget, essentially what the government does is government prioritizes which public good to provide in return for the lump sum payment that I get. I get a lump sum payment in form of taxes, generally taxes, and in return I provide some public good. This is the idea behind government budget. The idea behind government budget is that government provides public goods in return for general payment from public, that is taxes. Because taxes that the government collects are limited, but the demand for public goods is very high. Therefore, the government is required to prioritize provision of those public goods. This is what a government budget is. This is essentially the objective of government budgeting. If we break down this objective into its constituents, क्या क्या constituents है? पहला constituent है expense. How much money should be spent? How much public goods should be provided? Second constituent है revenue. How much money can we collect? What can be done to collect more revenue? From whom can we collect? Can we collect more revenue from those who are rich as compared to those who are poor? For rich, many of their demands they are capable to meet themselves, but for poor, their demands, even basic demands, they are unable to meet. Should I take the payment of taxes from rich or from the poor, or should there be some differential treatment? Second aspect of government budgeting. Third aspect, if I am taking money but which is less with respect to my expenditure requirement, then I will have to borrow. I will have to see what macroeconomic goals I am going to meet if I do this expense. Borrowing करेंगे तो क्या क्या macroeconomic goals compromise हो सकते हैं, क्या क्या meet हो सकते हैं. If I break down the government budget objective into three essential constituents, it is expenses, revenue, and relation between expenses and revenue. Government collects a lump sum payment in form of tax. Government uses that tax to provide public goods. Government would like to provide as many public goods on a priority basis to as much population. Government would like to collect as much tax, but at the same time, it would like to collect tax in a differential manner. Redistribution of income can be achieved from tax collection of the government. And finally, certain macroeconomic goals are sought to be achieved from its expenses strategy and taxing strategy. It would want to achieve macroeconomic goals pertaining to, let's say, inflation, unemployment, government debt, etc., etc. This is what is done in a government budget. Let's quickly have a look at what are the objectives of government budgeting. Broadly, the government seeks to achieve the following from different aspects of government budget. Number one, government seeks to achieve expenditure. Expenditure is done, allocation function बोलते हैं इसको. This is called as allocation function. Allocation of public goods. Government tries to allocate public goods through its expenses. Second, taxation. Government tries to collect taxes and perform a redistribution function while collecting taxes. Collecting taxes in a manner that is fair, equitable, and distribution of income can take place through this task of collection of taxes. through extent of expenditure and taxes. पहला है allocation function, दूसरा है distribution function through taxation. Second is what can be studied with the what can be realized from the extent of taxes and expenses. Stabilization function, stabilization of the economy. Certain macroeconomic goals are sought to be achieved using the extent of expenses and incomes, that is revenue, taxes. Achieving desirable level of inflation, creating conditions for growth, achieving unemployment targets or targets of employment, achieving targets of exports, etc., etc. Various macroeconomic goals are sought to be achieved from expenses and taxation strategy. Three essential function हम बोलते हैं सरकार के: allocation function, distribution function and stabilization function. Allocation मतलब क्या? Allocating public goods. Distribution मतलब क्या? Distribution of income. Taxation is done in a manner that redistributes income. Stabilization, expenses and taxes are done in a manner, expenses are done and taxes are collected in a manner which achieves certain macroeconomic goals, stabilize the economy. Goals with respect to inflation, growth, unemployment, exports, etc. Objectives of a government budget. I hope this is clear to everybody. What are the objectives? Expenses, taxes, and the extent of expenses and taxes. Any government budget, any government anywhere in the world, any government, North Korean government से लेके American government तक, any government anywhere in the world will have objective of trying to reduce inequalities in the society, let's say through distribution function, trying to provide as much public goods as possible, especially those which are on priority. Any government would try to achieve some sort of macroeconomic goals with respect to inflation, unemployment, growth, exports, etc. Any government. Objective of government budget को अगर हम देखें, please pay attention everybody, if we look at objectives of government budget, the objectives of expenditure, taxation and extent of expenditure and taxation, that is the allocation function of the government, the distribution function of the government and stabilization function of the government. These functions are done with objectives of redistributing income in the society, providing public goods in the society, achieving a level of growth in the society, achieving a desirable level of inflation and maintaining that, ensuring that the economy is competitive, ensuring that the economy is producing in an environmental friendly manner, ensuring that there is less unemployment in the society, ensuring that there are more exports that the economy does. Any government budget will try to ensure these objectives. तो कोई भी गवर्नमेंट हो, किसी भी टाइप की कहीं भी गवर्नमेंट हो, वो हमेशा ये एलोकेशन फंक्शन, डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन फंक्शन और स्टेबलाइजेशन फंक्शन, इन्हीं फंक्शन को अचीव करने की कोशिश करेगी. At a broad level, these are the goals that any government would want to achieve. Low inflation, low and stable inflation, low unemployment, high growth, less inequality, less poverty, ये सब गोल्स हैं हर एक गवर्नमेंट के. Any government always will have these goals. Any government will have these goals. It is the strategy to achieve these goals that differentiates governments. It is the strategy to achieve these goals that differentiates which path a government is going to take with respect to achievement of these objectives. Objectives सबके common हैं. Objectives of government budget are common for every government in the world. Every government would like to perform its distribution, allocation and stabilization function for pursuit of some noble objectives. Objectives are same. What budget does in every economy is same or is prophesied to be same. But how it does is what differentiates budget. How do governments spend? How do governments collect? How do governments achieve this stabilization function? This is what differentiates different type of governments. This is what differentiates essentially what are growth and investment models. यहीं से निकल के आते हैं growth and investment models. Growth models and investment models यहीं से निकल के आते हैं. What is essentially that we study in growth model and investment model? पढ़ चुके हो अब आप. You have studied growth and investment models. I am not going to teach them again. It's not my responsibility to teach growth and investment, but I'll just quickly tell you in pursuant of this continuation what we are discussing. I'll just quickly tell you what is this. Growth model and investment models. Simply, what is the strategy that government is pursuing to achieve these objectives? Growth किस तरीके से achieve की जाए? Should it be inclusive growth? Should it be trickle down approach to growth? In our discussion on inequality, वहां पे हम डिस्कस कर चुके हैं. इनइक्वालिटी वाले पार्ट में हमने ऑलरेडी देखा था डिफरेंट मॉडल्स ऑफ ग्रोथ. In our discussion on inequality, we have already seen this diagram. Growth models वाला part, trickle down approach to growth and inclusive growth. We have seen, we have written. ये हम देख चुके हैं पहले भी. What is the strategy of growth that the government wants to pursue? How does it want to spend its resources? Expenditure function to provide public goods. To provide public goods, you need more revenue, income, taxation function. To provide public goods, you need more revenue. How will the government generate more revenue? It will generate more revenue if it focuses its resources in those sectors which can grow fast. Expenditure in those sectors which have potential to grow fast. Spend money in those sectors which have potential to grow fast. They will grow fast. You will collect more taxes. Taxation function. You collect more taxes. You have greater ability to provide public goods. Trickle down approach to growth. Focus your resources. Objectives सबके same हैं. लेकिन manner of achievement of those objectives is different. How do you want to achieve those objectives? One way is that your model of growth is trickle down approach to growth. Focus your resources on the top grows, collect more taxes, and these taxes redistributed to the people at the bottom. We discussed in this trickle down model of growth, हमने discuss किया था पहले जब inequality वाले discussion किया था. In this trickle down approach to growth, the bottom is the passive beneficiary. मतलब the benefits to the bottom are not percolating down as a matter of right. Government invests at the top in those sectors which have high potential for growth. सरकार के पास लिमिटेड रिसोर्सेज हैं और सरकार ने वो लिमिटेड रिसोर्सेज उन सेक्टर्स में इन्वेस्ट किए जहां पे हाई पोटेंशियल ऑफ ग्रोथ है. Number one, it has to be assumed that the choice of those sectors was correct. That is, when those limited resources were invested, then your investment paid off. Those sectors grew at a fast pace. Second, when those sectors grew at a fast pace, you were able to collect taxes from those sectors. तो पहला assumption, choice of investment सही था, sector. दूसरा assumption, वो sectors जब grow करे तब सरकार ने उनसे ज्यादा टैक्स कलेक्ट किया. तीसरा assumption, जब सरकार ने टैक्स कलेक्ट किया, when government collects more taxes from these sectors, then it will either reinvest back those tax here or will let it flow down as a benefit to the bottom. Government will think, पहले हमारे पास 5 रुपए थे, 5 रुपए हमने एक सेक्टर में लगाए तो अब हमको उसके 20 रुपए मिल रहे हैं. तो अब क्यों ना हम 20 रुपए वापस से उसी सेक्टर में लगाएं? Why not invest 20 back in that sector so that now we get 100? Assumption that government will reinvest these taxes back in these sectors, or will it reinvest these taxes, the resources, to the people at the bottom? Assumption number 3. Assumption number 4 or condition number 4, that there is an efficiency in government expenses. Government is willing to spend and there is high efficiency in government expense. All these things determine what benefit will the bottom receive. Bottom is a passive beneficiary. The benefits to the bottom are conditioned upon, number one, whether the choice of sector of the government for investment of limited resource was right or not. Number two, whether the sector in which limited resources were invested grew at a fast pace and government was able to collect taxes from that sector or not. टैक्स इवेजन हो रहा है या फिर सरकार एक्चुअल में टैक्स कलेक्ट कर पा रही है. थर्ड, when government collects taxes, then is government investing those resources back into these sectors or is using for benefit of those at the bottom. Fourth, whether the government's expenses for welfare of the people at the bottom are efficient or not. The people at the bottom are passive beneficiaries. Trickle down approach to growth. Trickle down model of spending resources, model of growth versus हमने inclusive growth भी डिस्कस किया था डिटेल में कि क्या है inclusive growth. In inclusive growth, the bottom is not the passive beneficiary of resources. Rather, bottom acts as a, if you remember the word, active contributor. Active contributor. Distinguishing feature of inclusive growth from trickle down model of growth. Bottom is not passive beneficiary, rather bottom is active contributor. Inclusive growth को अगर ऐसे याद करने चले गए, inclusive means health and education, तो बस यहीं पे अटक जाओगे. Inclusive means social sector expense, यहीं पे अटक जाओगे inclusive growth. लेकिन अगर inclusive growth को ऐसे देखते हो, inclusive growth means that bottom is the active contributor in the growth process versus it was passive beneficiary here. Bottom is the active contributor, meaning that they are capable to contribute. Second, they have got opportunities where they can contribute. When they contribute to growth process, they enjoy the fruits of growth as a matter of right, not because of certain assumptions to be fulfilled. यहां पे चार assumption fulfill, चार stages of conditions हैं, वो fulfill होंगी तब bottom को benefit मिलेगा. यहां पे bottom will enjoy the benefit of growth because as a matter of their right, because they are an active contributor. Make them capable and ensure that there are jobs which can utilize their capability. Inclusive growth. Another model of growth. Government budgeting समझ में आ रहा है अब? Expenditure function that government seeks to achieve. Allocation function, taxation function, stabilization function. What is it that what is the government's strategy with respect to government budget? Is it of trickle down? Is it of inclusive growth? Versus, not versus exactly. Now we have got a new model, as in not a new model exactly, but now we have got new goals in form of sustainable development goals. SDGs. I remember even this. जब मैंने आपको ट्रिकल डाउन और इंक्लूसिव ग्रोथ पढ़ाया था तब मैंने आपको बोला था सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट गोल्स के बारे में मैं आपको एक पीपीटी दिखाऊंगा इन अवर डिस्कशन ऑन गवर्नमेंट बजटिंग. वो ये पीपीटी. I said that I will just simply show you one PPT with respect to sustainable development goals in our discussion. Sustainable development goals as in sustainable development. Growth model of sustainable development. Sustainable development has again various objectives here. Sustainable development goals के 17 objectives, 17 goals, 169 targets to be met here. Sustainable development of the present without compromising the ability of a future. The manner of your expenditure function, taxation function, stabilization function, the manner in which you want to achieve these goals is as such that you grow at present without compromising the ability of future. Sustainable development किसको बोलते हैं? Growth in present without compromising the ability of future. That is what sustainable development is. SDGs, sustainable development goals. These are various models of growth that can be pursued when it comes to various ways in which you want to achieve government goals of objectives of government budget. More specific than these growth models are investment models. गवर्नमेंट बजट और ऑब्जेक्टिव्स ऑफ बजट वो एक बर्ड्स आई व्यू है. सबका बर्ड्स आई व्यू सेम है कि हमको यही ऑब्जेक्टिव अचीव करने हैं. वर्सेस वो ऑब्जेक्टिव्स कैसे अचीव करते हैं, हमारा मॉडल ऑफ ग्रोथ क्या है. We want to achieve those noble objectives. Our model of growth is trickle down, inclusive plus sustainable. What is our model of growth? Then at a more specific level comes investment model. Government has got limited resources. अभी तक तो हमने क्या बात करी थी? अभी हमने बात करी है that government allocates resources to the top. How does government choose the top? How to choose what is top, what is this top, ये top क्या है, कौन सा सेक्टर चूज करना है, कौन सा रीजन चूज करना है, कहां पे इन्वेस्ट करना है, वेयर शुड मनी बी स्पेंड. दिस इज अ ब्रॉड लेवल व्यू. इन्वेस्टमेंट मॉडल्स इज अ मोर ग्राउंड लेवल व्यू, मोर स्पेसिफिक व्यू. हाउ टू चूज विच सेक्टर और विच रीजन, which area to do your limited investment in, वो है इन्वेस्टमेंट मॉडल्स. तो ग्रोथ मॉडल्स क्या है? ग्रोथ मॉडल्स इज दैट ब्रॉडर व्यू. गवर्नमेंट बजट के ऑब्जेक्टिव्स, इवन द ब्रॉडर व्यू, ब्रॉडेस्ट व्यू, बर्ड्स आई व्यू. बर्ड्स आई व्यू कह रहा है कि भाई ग्रोथ होनी चाहिए. बर्ड्स आई व्यू कह रहा है इन्फ्लेशन कम होनी चाहिए, अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट कम होनी चाहिए. Bird's eye view saying exports ज्यादा, competitiveness ज्यादा, environment अच्छी. That is bird's eye view. Noble goals that everybody likes to pursue. Second, growth model. How do you want to achieve those goals? Is it trickle down? Is it inclusive? Is it inclusive plus sustainable? What is your model of growth? Third, at a more closer level, you said that I will pursue inclusive growth. Okay. How do you plan to identify poor? How do you plan to identify areas of industrial development where jobs will be created? How do you plan to invest money in social sector? Do you want to invest money for skill development? Do you want money for education? How do you want to plan to invest money for education? You said that I will choose trickle down model of growth. How do you plan to choose which area, which sector, which industry to invest your limited resource in? कैसे करना है? A more closer view is the investment model. समझ में आया क्या है जो हम इन्वेस्टमेंट मॉडल में पढ़ते हैं? In investment model, essentially you study two aspects. One is the aspect of priority, second is the aspect of leverage. In investment models, essentially there are two aspects that you study, the aspect of priority and the aspect of leverage. Priority वाला aspect क्या है? How do you prioritize? कैसे prioritize करोगे sector को? Which sector do you want to choose? देखो, I don't know how has the faculty who has taught you, how have they taught? Their manner of teaching would be different, but ultimate contents same होंगे. Their manner of organizing this knowledge would be different. देखो, because दिस इज माई पीपीटी, दिस इज माई वे ऑफ, मैं इस चीज को इसके साथ पढ़ाता हूं, इसीलिए मैं आपको इससे पढ़ा रहा हूं. आई एम टीचिंग गवर्नमेंट बजटिंग. इन गवर्नमेंट बजटिंग आई टॉट ऑब्जेक्टिव ऑफ गवर्नमेंट बजट. आई टीच आफ्टर दैट ग्रोथ मॉडल्स. आफ्टर दैट आई टीच इन्वेस्टमेंट मॉडल्स. दैट इज माई वे ऑफ टीचिंग. नाउ बिकॉज इट हैज बीन सेग्रीगेटेड, द फैकल्टी हु हैज taught you this, they would have taught you in their own manner. So I don't know whether they use these terms or not, like terms of prioritization or leverage. But at the end of the day, उन्होंने वही content पढ़ाया होगा जो मैं आपको अगर पढ़ा रहा था तो मैं पढ़ाता. They would have taught PPP models, or they are going to teach PPP model, public-private partnership model. How to choose which sectors to invest in. For example, champion sectors वगैरह वहां पे invest करना. Sectors which have high potential for growth, high potential for employment, high potential for exports, futuristic sectors. Invest in those sectors. कैसे choose करें? Where to choose? Where to begin? That is what investment model is. Government has limited amount of resources. उन limited resources को कहां पे invest करना है? Where do you want to invest those limited resources so that the output is maximum? This is what you study in investment models. Since this is what investment and growth is, I hope that this has been done in your other classes. Investment model क्या है? Growth नहीं होगा. Investment, okay, it has not been done, but it will be done. It will be done in your classes. मुझे भी ऐसा लग रहा था कि इन्वेस्टमेंट मॉडल क्योंकि वो लास्ट में पढ़ाई जाती है चीज. एसेंशियली इन योर इन्वेस्टमेंट मॉडल क्लासेस, देखो मैं नहीं पढ़ाने वाला हूं, लेकिन क्योंकि मैं मैंने आपको पहले बोला था स्लाइड्स तब की हैं जब मैं इनको साथ में पढ़ाता था. इन योर इन्वेस्टमेंट मॉडल क्लासेस what is that is going to be taught to you is essentially this is not that is going to be taught, ये आपको नहीं पढ़ाया जाएगा शायद. You will be taught basically PPP, public private partnership. PPP मॉडल आपको पढ़ाए जाएंगे, डिफरेंट PPP मॉडल, BOT, build operate transfer model, EPC, engineering procurement construction, and HAM, hybrid annuity model. This is what is going to be taught. How do you invest your money so that you maximize output? That is what going to be taught. उसको ऑर्गेनाइज करने का तरीका जो भी सर आपको पढ़ाएंगे वो डिफरेंट हो सकता है, बट अल्टीमेटली दीज थिंग्स वुड बी टॉट. आई थिंक बिकॉज नाउ कोर्स को काफी इलैबोरेटली और कॉम्प्रिहेंसिवली हम कवर कर रहे हैं. आई थिंक यू वुड हैव बीन टॉट मे बी इन इंडस्ट्रियल पार्ट. आई थिंक पीयूष हैज टेकन दैट पार्ट. आई थिंक आपको ये सब चीजें बताई होंगी. इंपोर्ट सब्स्टिट्यूशन क्या होता है, हैरोड डोमर मॉडल या फिर नेहरू मालोनोबिस मॉडल, ये बताया था. हैरोड डोमर, नेहरू मालोनोबिस, हाँ, यस, दीज थिंग्स हैव बीन टॉट टू यू. All these are part of what is investment models. ठीक है, तो these have been covered now. PPP वाला पार्ट कवर नहीं हुआ होगा, वो इन्वेस्टमेंट मॉडल्स में कवर होगा. PPP वाला पार्ट will be covered. These parts, import substitution, focus on heavy industry, industrial policy. This is what essentially is our total understanding of investment models. ऊपर specific decision with respect to how and where to invest. मैंने क्या दो वर्ड्स यूज किए थे, मैं फिर से यूज कर देता हूं अगर आपको प्रॉब्लम है तो. प्रायोरिटाइजेशन and leverage. I use these two terms. Prioritization means choosing which sector, which area to invest. Priority. Leverage का मतलब क्या होता है? Lever. The word leverage comes from the word lever. Lever is a force multiplier. You invest 10, you bring 10, I will bring 100. Leverage. You bring 10, I will give you 100. Therefore, अगर मैं 1 लाख रुपए इन्वेस्ट करता हूं और उस पर 10% रिटर्न कमाता हूं, माई प्रॉफिट इज 10,000 रुपीज. अगर मैं 10 लाख रुपए इन्वेस्ट करूंगा और उस पर भी 10% रिटर्न कमाऊंगा तो माई प्रॉफिट इज 1 लाख रुपीज. तो मैं क्या चाहूंगा कि मैं ज्यादा से ज्यादा इन्वेस्ट करूं. तो मैं अपने ब्रोकर से बात करूंगा कि गिव मी सम लेवरेज. आई विल आस्क माई ब्रोकर, गिव मी सम लेवरेज. आई विल ब्रिंग 1 lakh, you give me 10 lakhs. Leveraging is multiplying, force multiplier. Coming back to investment models, what is leverage? Leverage is government invests some money and it acts as a multiplier in the economy. Government invests 10 rupees and from that government is able to produce an output of 100 rupees. Leverage. Government invests 10. When government invests 10, it incentivizes private sector to bring 50. सरकार 10 इन्वेस्ट करेगी तो हम 50 इन्वेस्ट करेंगे. And this way we can produce an output of 1000. Leverage. Leveraging the resources and capability of the private sector to produce more output in the economy. This is again done through, this is again what we study in investment models. And I think these words may not be used in the class, but this is essentially that you're going to study. ये leverage के अंदर ही आप पढ़ोगे PPP. यहीं पे आप पढ़ते हो PPP, public private partnership. Government brings money, private sector brings money in order for more output that can be produced. This is what we study in investment models. The next part that we are going to study, अब नहीं पढ़ेंगे, अब हम class, now we are not going to do anything else. Now in tomorrow's class, what we are going to study is this. देखो, this is, if you can see, this is what I usually teach. Export-led growth and all, public-private partnership, different PPP models, BOT, EPC, HAM, Swiss challenge. This is what you will be taught in your investment models classes. In our next class, from our next class, this is what we are going to start with. Accounting in government budget. Government budget में accounting, ये हम अगली क्लास में start करेंगे. We will start with what is revenue account, what is capital account, what is plan and non-plan expense, what are different types of deficits, accounting कैसे करते हैं सरकारी बजट में, ये हम क्लास अगली क्लास में स्टार्ट करेंगे. उसके बाद हम देखेंगे नेक्स्ट क्लास टैक्सेशन एंड देन एन एनालिसिस ऑफ दैट. होपफुली इन नेक्स्ट 3 or 4 classes, hopefully next 4 classes we will be able to finish. In next 3 classes, आज की क्लास total 4 classes, hopefully next 3 classes we shall be able to finish our discussion on government budget. ठीक है, चलो सवाल देख लेता हूं मैं. If there is any question, I will answer that question and then I'll take your leave. स्वयं सिंह का सवाल है, सर इन द जीडीपी चैप्टर यू हैड टोल्ड दैट जीडीपी कैन इंक्रीज if there is a rise in taxes or reduction in subsidies, or if there is a general rise in price. And simultaneously you also told that shell companies do not have any effect on GDP calculation. Also, sir, if shell companies create tax rebates, then GDP should decrease. And in that place, there is a relationship between them and shell companies have an effect on GDP. यार shell companies के बारे में जहां तक मुझे याद है, as far as I remember, I think I have said in the class when I talked about this shell companies and their effect on GDP, जब हमने GDP calculation की बात करी थी, I think I have said in the class that we'll talk about shell companies when we discuss taxation part. तो थोड़ा सा वेट करो, I'll tell you that how are shell companies used to save taxes. How do they help in tax evasion? I'll talk about them there. कि टैक्स इवेजन में वो कैसे काम करते हैं. Having said that, when it comes to their effect on calculation of GDP, the manner in which we calculate GDP now, that is not affected by shell companies. Yes, one aspect is there that shell companies lead to reduction of tax collected by the government, and therefore when you value your GDP at market prices, जब आप अपनी GDP को market price पे value करते हो, now market price includes taxes. If amount of tax collected by government is less, then value of tax in calculation of GDP would be less. Why is it less? Because of shell companies. तो yes, GDP का जो calculation होगा वो थोड़ा सा effect होगा because of shell companies. Why? Because amount of tax that the government collect reduces because of shell companies. Calculation के दौरान. But when it comes to calculating the output, how much output has been produced, then that is not affected by shell companies. You are right. Good catch. Swayam. Good catch. Yes, you are right. I'll repeat this for others as well. Shell companies, how do they help in evasion of taxes? We'll discuss later on, number one. Number two, shell companies, how do they affect GDP calculation? We have done. We discussed that shell companies do not affect GDP calculation because simply the output or value added is distributed amongst multiple firms. एक फर्म ने वैल्यू प्रोड्यूस करी वर्सेस मल्टीपल फर्म्स ने वो वैल्यू प्रोड्यूस करी. Since value added is only redistributed amongst multiple firms, therefore shell companies do not have an effect on changing the value of GDP. But as far as effect is concerned, there is one more effect, that shell companies lead to reduction of taxes that the government collects. जब हम टैक्सेस को अकाउंट करके जीडीपी की वैल्यू कैलकुलेट करेंगे, तब जीडीपी की वैल्यू कम आएगी क्योंकि टैक्सेस की वैल्यू कम होगी. यस, यू आर राइट इन दैट. ठीक है, गुड कैच. नेक्स्ट, अखिलेश का क्वेश्चन. डियर सर, व्हाट इज द टर्म एंकरेज बायस इन इंसॉल्वेंसी एंड बैंक्रप्सी कोड? आई थिंक आई हैव नॉट यूज दिस टर्म इन द क्लास. एंकरेज बायस मैंने टर्म यूज नहीं करी है. एंकरेज बायस देखो जानने की आवश्यकता है नहीं वैसे क्या होता है एंकरेज बायस. मैं आपको बहुत ही सिंपल भाषा में 2 लाइन में बताता हूं क्या होता है. बायस मीन्स व्हाट? दैट समथिंग इज बायस्ड टुवर्ड्स समथिंग. Some decision is biased towards something, or some factor is causing some sort of a bias. That is what a bias is. For example, in insolvency and bankruptcy code, there is a requirement that committee of creditors will take a decision when there is a 55% majority value. अगर कमिटी ऑफ क्रेडिटर्स को पास जो डिसीजन प्रेजेंट किया गया है, इफ इट हैज बीन प्रेजेंटेड विद अ रेजोल्यूशन प्लान एंड देयर इज नॉट एन अग्रीमेंट ऑफ 55% ऑफ creditors by value, then that decision will not be accepted. That means the decision of committee of creditors is biased towards certain high value lenders. This is simply what anchorage bias is. और थोड़ा डिटेल में होता है बट इतना समझना काफी है. भरत का सवाल है, डियर सर, could you please explain how would depreciation of rupee lead to increase in bond yield? ये अगली क्लास में बता दूं. कल वाली क्लास में प्लीज पूछ लेना इस क्वेश्चन को, डेप्रिसिएशन ऑफ रूपी और इंक्रीज इन बॉन्ड यील्ड, ये कल वाली क्लास में एक्सप्लेन कर दूंगा, बिकॉज अभी काफी सारे स्टूडेंट्स जा भी चुके हैं क्लास से. I think this question requires a little bit more. It will take about 10 minutes for me to explain, but I think it is important for others also. भरत, कल पूछना जरूर. देखो मेरे को अपने आप तो याद नहीं रहेगा आपने क्या पूछा है. Please ask this question again. I will explain. I will explain tomorrow this question. Effect of depreciation of rupee and bond yields. I'll explain these things. दर्शन का सवाल है, Sir, this question from National Income Accounting and Income Determination chapter, we know that national income calculation takes into account net factor income from abroad. As we get GNP from GDP and then NNP from GNP and finally national income. However, in the chapter on income determination, NCERT states that without government imposing indirect taxes and subsidies, the total value of final goods and services produced in the economy, GDP, becomes identical to national income. Resultantly, they go on to refer to GDP and national income interchangeably in the entire chapter. I understand the indirect tax and subsidy removal part, but if only that is removed, should it not be national income is equal to GNP and not national income GDP, as NFIA part has not been dealt with? Let me explain this. Others, please also listen. यार again ये ऐसा क्वेश्चन आपने पूछा है जो कि मैं चाहूंगा कि बाकी लोगों को भी एक्सप्लेन कर पाऊं. अगेन बिकॉज मोस्ट कल एक्सप्लेन कर दूंगा यार. द आंसर टू दिस क्वेश्चन इज वेरी सिंपल. बहुत ही सिंपल है, लेकिन ये जो डाउट आपने पूछा है ना, ये डाउट बहुत जेन्युइन है. द क्वेश्चन, आई विल रिपीट, प्लीज लिसन दर्शन. द क्वेश्चन दैट यू हैव आस्क्ड, द आंसर इज वेरी सिंपल, but the doubt is very genuine. I would want others also to know the answer to this question. Please wait for tomorrow's class. I'll answer this question tomorrow. Please इसको आप copy paste कर लो और कल भेज देना. प्लीज कल भेज देना, मैं इसको कल आंसर कर लूंगा इस सवाल को. ठीक है, चलो let's end the class. I'm really sorry I did not answer the last two questions, but having said that, I think that these questions require attention of all the class. Therefore, I'll answer them tomorrow. फाइन. तो चलो कल मिलते हैं कल की क्लास में. टिल देन टेक केयर एवरीबॉडी. चलो और कोई सवाल? हाँ, नो, चलो ठीक है. गुड बाय एवरीबॉडी, टेक केयर, गुड नाइट, कल मिलते हैं, बाय बाय.